For many years, Russia has proudly carried the label of one of the world's most diverse defense industries. Kalibr cruise missiles, T-90 tank families, Su-34 bomber jets, and the now famous Lancet Shahed kamikaze drones. If you listen closely to the Kremlin's official rhetoric, all these systems are tied together under a single umbrella and flow onto the battlefield via production lines that are said to be uninterruptible. But the harsh Ukrainian moves that began in June 2025 and grew step by step until the end of July cut this chain in unexpected places. It didn't happen overnight. The Kiev team drew up a long-term plan, marked the weak links on the map, and stretched the range of unmanned aerial vehicles a little more each month. The result was a sudden stumble in defense production, the Putin administration's most valuable showcase. Let's make this clear. What we're talking about isn't the explosion of a single ammunition depot in a border town. What we are referring to is the successive shutdown of the nodes of a complex supply network that feeds the electronic brains of Kalibr missiles, the fluids that lubricate the pistons of T-90 tanks, the bombs of Su-34s, and the control cards of Shahed-derived kamikaze drones. That is why it is not an exaggeration to say that Putin's defense industry is collapsing. The figures you're about to see will concretely demonstrate how Russia has begun to count its ammunition. Here's the really important part. The drone attacks did not just blow up warehouses, they also shook the Russian central bank's plan to keep the ruble afloat. Let's break down the timeline step by step. The first attack on the Rezonit complex, located approximately 40 kilometers from Moscow in the last week of June, served as a starting signal. The facility produced special hydraulic oils for the guidance valves of Kalibr and Iskander missiles, Lancet servo motors, and engine bearing fluids for T-90 tanks. Annual production volume was 121 tons. One-third of this volume was allocated to ground forces, one-fourth to the missile air segment, and the remainder to civilian machinery. A Beaver U-type drone that penetrated the roof in the middle of the night ignited barrels filled with isopropyl, and the fire spread along the facility. The warehouse floor turned into a pile of metal within 30 minutes. The high heat melted the internal computers in the sensor calibration room. The impact of this attack on the front lines was faster than expected. The maintenance departments of Russian tank units serving in the Donetsk area reported a delay in the delivery of hydraulic fluid. By the end of the same week, 15% of the T-90 tanks deployed to the front via Belgorod were recalled for repairs. When the fluid required for the engine piston bearings was found to be missing, the tank's speed limits were reduced, and body vibrations increased during firing. What seemed like a negligible chemical loss undermined both fire superiority and maneuverability in the field. At the same time, a psychological barrier was erected, as this was the first time an industrial facility so close to the Kremlin had been swallowed up. Let's now move on to Tambov. The nitrocellulose gunpowder reactor here was a modernized version of the basic ammunition concept from the Soviet era. It produced the propellant for a wide range of products, from artillery shells to MLRS rockets. 3 separate waves of Ukrainian UAVs struck the reactor's main boiler. The boiler was destroyed, and the plant immediately entered an emergency shutdown procedure. It was thought that production would be buffered by ready stocks, but reports indicated that gunpowder supplies to the front were delayed by around 30%. This reduced the intensity of Russian shelling on the Kharkiv-Liman line. When data from the field was combined with satellite images, the loss to Tambov became clear. The Russian rocket gun price index jumped 14% in a single day. The Kremlin intervened in state procurement contracts to suppress prices, but this move also plunged the facility into a damage control spiral. The third stop was the Cheboksary electronics plant in Chuvashia. The Cheboksary electronics factory supplied critical electronic components for Shahed-type kamikaze drones and Iskander missiles. Unmanned aerial vehicles reaching this facility, located 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, have proven that no region of Russia is safe. This includes the safe zone designated in Russian defense plans. When the drone swarm penetrated the upper section, automation robots were disabled, and assembly presses came to a halt. It is estimated that this disruption will require up to a month of repairs. The outcome is clear. The Shahed production line is already 4,000 units behind schedule. Field demands have collided with production plans. While the arrival of kits from Iran to the assembly hall in Yelabuga was already problematic, the malfunction of the card press will extend the delivery timeline by another 2 to 3 weeks. Why did Kiev specifically choose Cheboksary? Because this facility's lower production line manufactures a critical control unit known as the P500-based integrated chip, which has no Chinese equivalent. By targeting this chip, Ukraine aimed to slow down Russia's Shahid stockpile in terms of quality rather than quantity. Moscow is in chaos once again, but this time it wasn't a bomb falling from the sky that grounded flights, but a code entered on a keyboard. There was panic at airports and uncertainty on screens. Russia's civil aviation system, considered the heart of the country, suddenly shut down. There were no takeoffs or landings. Passengers waited for hours, watching the screens helplessly. It appears that this attack was silent, but its impact was as devastating as a missile. So how was this attack planned? What vulnerabilities were exploited? And what were the consequences? On July 28th, the heart of Moscow suddenly fell silent. At Sheremetyevo Airport, passengers' eyes were glued to the screens, which suddenly went dark. Check-in systems stopped, flight data was erased, and announcements fell silent. A comprehensive cyber attack on the systems of Aeroflot, Russia's largest airline, left hundreds of passengers stranded in the terminal. Neither planes could take off nor passengers reach their destinations. The reason was clear. The target was not just an airline, but Russia's global reputation. Two names have emerged as being behind the attack: the Ukrainian hacker group Silent Crow and Belarus Cyber Partisans, which opposes the Belarusian regime. Both groups claim to have maintained persistent access to Russia's aviation network for approximately 1 year. According to the details provided, route-level access was gained to a total of 7,000 physical and virtual machines that power Aeroflot. Over 30,000 internal IP addresses were mapped. Critical data was first backed up and copied to multiple nodes in the cloud. Then, data wiping scripts were executed on the target servers. The copied information allegedly included a 22 terabyte email archive, 12 terabytes of customer and loyalty program records, and 8 terabytes of engineering and fleet maintenance documents. Some of this data was published in parts on Telegram, with a note stating that the remainder would be released to the public in the future. When Aeroflot's digital infrastructure collapsed, more than 100 flights were cancelled and dozens were delayed. Airport employees were forced to resort to manual, paper-based systems to maintain basic operations. Passengers sought refuge in information desks, causing panic. Chaos reigned in the terminal. Shared images show people dragging their luggage under darkened screens, unsure of what to do, while staff were helpless in the face of connectivity issues. The attack was not limited to Aeroflot's own systems. Aeroflot is not just an airline. It is the Russian state's showcase on the global stage. This institution, one of the Kremlin's primary tools for managing domestic transportation, also symbolizes Russia's international prestige. Aeroflot subsidiaries, Rossiya and the low-cost carrier Pobeda Airlines, experienced significant disruptions, ranging from reservation systems to internal operations. Cancellations and delays have also occurred on international flights to countries such as Belarus, Armenia, and Uzbekistan. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov openly acknowledged the severity of the attack, describing it as alarming. The Russian Prosecutor General's office immediately launched a criminal investigation into the incident. But with attacks like this, the damage spreads before the legal process even starts. According to Silent Crow, it's going to be really hard to get the system back up and running. The hacker group says most of the systems have either been completely wiped or are inaccessible. They estimate that repairs could cost over $30 million. This figure only accounts for the cost of rebuilding the hardware and software infrastructure. Losses from business interruption, operational damages, and the consequences of data security breaches have not yet been calculated. The Russian Civil Aviation Agency disabled the digital NOTAM channel and temporarily switched to analog radio notifications. This alone posed a security risk that could set the country's air traffic network back by at least 10 years. The Russian domestic air transport market had already suffered a severe blow over the past 2 years. Following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the Boeing and Airbus spare parts embargo forced the Russian fleet into cannibalization, while the integration of the Comac C919 from China was stalled by procedural obstacles. The crisis deepened with this cyber incident, as Aeroflot's engineering records, maintenance cycles, and airworthiness reports were also lost. Without these documents, it is impossible to obtain safety certification from international aviation authorities. Russia's cogwheels are no longer turning. The engines that once carried millions of people and goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific are now silent. Russia, once a giant in manufacturing, can no longer deliver anything on time, even within its own borders. Car factories are empty, assembly lines are gathering dust. There are locomotives, but the rails are broken. Trains that need to pass are waiting at the head of sabotaged tracks. Everything is slowing down, everything is stopping. This is not just the collapse of metal or machinery, this is the clogging of the arteries of a huge economy. If the economic arteries are blocked and industry is collapsing, what kind of dead end will Vladimir Putin face next? Russia is a country that spans continents in terms of land area. What holds this vast expanse of 17 million square kilometers together is not just borders, it is railways. These railways, which function like the veins of the country, do not just transport passengers. They keep the economy, the army, industry, and the state moving. Oil and gas exports reach ports via these lines. Coal reaches power plants. Grain reaches remote villages. And ammunition reaches the front lines. Resources extracted from mines deep in Siberia are transported by train to factories around Moscow. A shipment from Vladivostok can even reach the European border thousands of kilometers away. In a country where roads are closed in winter and air travel is a luxury for the public, railways are often the only option. But it is precisely this system that is currently being shaken. In 2023, 66% of ammunition going to the rear and 75% of heavy armored vehicle rotations were on rails. But at the end of 2024, Rojheldor Statistics published a red curve under the heading Cargo Park Time. The average waiting time for wagons was close to 12 hours, compared to less than 5 hours in 2021. Why did the waiting time increase? Firstly, Ukrainian drones regularly strike transport hubs such as Novocherkassk, Lykaya, and Bryansk. Rail repairs can be carried out, but each attack also burns sensors and signal cables, forcing trains to be controlled manually, reducing speed limits and increasing stop-start traffic. Secondly, there is a shortage of equipment due to the international embargo on spare parts. German-made wheel-bearing rollers, Japanese control relays, Swiss brake systems. Without these, the frequency of overhauls increases and depot line transfers slow down. The stoppage affects not only military shipments but also exports. In the first 7 months of 2025, Russia's rail transport suffered a serious shock. The country's freight volume fell by 6.8%. This is not only a continuation of the 4.1% decline experienced in the previous year, but also evidence of a weakening in the economic system's supporting pillars. Coal shipments decreased by 6.4%, while iron and steel products saw a decline of over 23%. Construction materials experienced a 21% collapse. In 2024, the average speed of freight trains dropped to 35.7 kilometers per hour. This is the lowest level recorded since the 1990s. The implications of these figures for Russia are dire. When raw materials fail to arrive on time, factory production grinds to a halt. This slowdown drives up costs, while consumers at the other end of the chain struggle to access fewer products at higher prices. In some regions, especially in 2024, there were delays of weeks in construction materials and basic food products. Small businesses are trying to shoulder the burden of rising transportation costs, while even large chains are reviewing their stocking policies against supply risks. But the real problem is the lack of alternatives. Western sanctions have greatly reduced sea routes, making Russia even more dependent on railways. Coal and grain, which used to be transported to ports by ship, are now piling up in rows of wagons. But these wagons are already full, and the rails are already worn out. The infrastructure of the system still relies on its Soviet legacy. Rails, bridges, and signaling systems that have not received proper maintenance for decades cannot handle the increased load. Critical investments have either been postponed or cut due to budget constraints. The result: chain delays, stranded cargo, and clogged logistics routes. Siberian coal is turning into piles before it reaches the ports. Some exporters have been forced to turn to more complicated and costly alternative routes via Belarus and Kazakhstan. But these routes both extend the distance and increase bureaucratic delays. Cement factories are suspending production due to fuel and raw material shortages. Metallurgical plants are missing contract deliveries. Food producers in the Far East are imposing capacity restrictions because they cannot transport packaging materials and energy. Grain silos across the country are overflowing, and flour and pasta prices are rising on supermarket shelves. Moreover, this pressure is not only economic, but also physical. Rails are wearing out from excessive loads, brake systems are malfunctioning, and breakdowns are accumulating rapidly due to difficulties in accessing spare parts. Russia was plunged into darkness by a series of explosions in Black Sea cities. Since the beginning of the war, the targets had been oil, production lines, fuel, and logistics routes. That was until the night of July 26. The night before, the Lukoil refinery in Krasnodar had been hit. But Ukraine's target the following night was much bigger. Russia's nerve centers on the battlefield were severed overnight. One of the most critical defense facilities in southern Russia was targeted by a one-way drone attack by Ukraine. Radars were disabled, electronic ears fell silent, and communication with the front lines was cut off in an instant. 2 drones flew in and plunged not only southern Russia, but the entire front line into darkness. It was like a sudden execution. So why did Ukraine target this Russian factory right now? On the night of July 26, Ukraine's target was the Signal Radio Electronic plant in Stavropol Krai, about 500 kilometers from the front line. Ukraine's attack targeted the facility's 2 most valuable sections. The first explosion occurred in a production hangar housing computer numerical control systems and imported high-precision production equipment. This section housed machines primarily from Europe and Asia, used for assembling radar antenna modules and frequency-controlled circuits. Following the attack, a fire broke out at the facility, with flames particularly affecting areas housing high-tech equipment. The second attack targeted an electronics component workshop, where electromechanical devices were assembled and tested. This workshop was responsible for calibrating active jammer systems before they were deployed in the field. For these reasons, Ukraine had targeted the factory for attack. Signal had carried forward the radar engineering tradition of the 1970s Leningrad School under Rostec's post-2014 consolidation under the KRET umbrella. The facility was one of 3 factories producing the subcomponents of electronic warfare platforms such as Krasuka 4, Murmansk BN, Borisogledska 2, and Repellent 1, which are actively deployed in the field. Among these were gallium nitride-based power amplifiers, wideband jamming modules, phased array antenna patch cards, and high-precision LiDAR detection sensors. The chips calibrated in these workshops were used to create the chemical composition of the jamming cloud deployed by Russian batteries in Donbas to blind HIMARS missiles in mid-air. Ukraine probably used UJ-26 Boba drones to cut this lifeline. The Boba family consists of inexpensive, piston-engine modular warhead-equipped unmanned vehicles with a range of over 1,000 kilometers. Their most striking feature is their use of electro-optical target recognition in the post-home phase while tracking GPS plus INS paths. The system gains immunity to signal interruptions by switching to inertial measurement units when entering Russia's jamming barrier and to an image library in the terminal phase. The engine noise is so faint that it cannot be distinguished from the idle noise of a car beyond 300 meters, and the radar cross-section is at the level described by aircraft engineers as pencil tip. Older generation batteries, like the S-300 V4, struggle to hit this mini-boy cruise missile, which is now fully operational, using the reflexes it receives from below. When the angle deficiency of the S-400 and Panzer groups is added, a tear opens in the umbrella over Stavropol. When it comes to the question of why Russia has not addressed this vulnerability, the answer lies in several layers. The first issue is geographical location. The signal complex is located just east of the city center, in the middle of open fields, right in the heart of the civilian industrial belt. This location was considered an advantage in the past because it allowed the complex to be disguised as a normal factory, which is ideal for a defense facility. But in reality, it means that the batteries cannot be placed close together, making it impossible to detect low-altitude targets with visual scans. The second layer is the lack of personnel. After the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the inland air defense units also entered a crisis of trained operators. 4 Pantsir teams withdrawn from Rostov, Voronezh and Belgorod and transferred to Stavropol were still waiting in temporary lodgings on the night of the attack. The third layer is the radar blind spot. The surveillance network in the Caucasus was designed to cover Chechnya's airspace. When the east-west drone corridor extended beyond the Simbirsk-Penza line, it fell outside the early warning range and was only detected by S-400 electronic scans 2 minutes before impact. When asked why the signal factory is so critical, many analysts first think of the Krasukha 4 vehicle family. The wheeled jammers, which were the first request of field commanders to cut the data link of HIMARS munitions on the front line, operate with the main sub-radiators and low-noise power dividers produced here. The Murmansk BN long-range HF jammers, the Moskva 1 passive sensor arrays that disable mobile artillery radars, and the RF cards that make up the Lear 3 Orlan control stations all share the same assembly hall as their common supplier. In short, this facility brings together the Russian military's electronic eyes and ears transmitter receiver sets under one roof. Japanese and German CNC machines installed in Workshop 14 grind super alloy waveguide blocks with micrometer deviation. Industrialists used to say among themselves, if we lose that machine, we'll fall 6 months behind. And now that utopia has turned into a nightmare. It is worth remembering that the factory is dependent on imported parts. For this reason, we believe that the repair time will be 4 to 5 months at best. Field analysts see the initial impact of the attack on spare stocks in the electronic warfare line. According to the Russian army's plan, 9 new Murmansk BN towers were to be deployed to the front by the end of 2025. 4 of these were waiting on the assembly table in Stavropol. If these units have been destroyed, the expansion of the radio jamming network in Sevastopol on the Black Sea coast will be delayed until next year. The Krasukha subsystems in the same hall contained the critical calibrations for 3 pickup adaptations that were scheduled to be sent to Donbass at the beginning of the summer. If the repair time is prolonged, the narrowband jamming capacity that provides protection against artillery fire will be reduced. Such a decline would be felt on the front lines even on the first day of operations, as a 1 or 2 percentage point drop in HIMARS interception rates would result in Ukrainian batteries hitting their targets more frequently. The numerous derailments, fires, and collisions in 2024 were concrete consequences of this collapse. With Western export restrictions cutting off access to German and Japanese parts that are vital for the railways, Russia is now struggling to find not only rail cars, but also solutions. The second major sector is automotive. Avtovaz in Tolyatti, the former Nissan plant in St. Petersburg, and Volkswagen's lines in Kaluga. In 2022, following the departure of Western partners, the Kremlin said that parts substitution will be completed in 6 months. 2 years later, the Rostat production index is 40% behind. Old Lada models have been brought back onto the production line, but most of the modern airbags, ABS, and Euro 6 engine standards come from the Chinese supply chain. This means dependence on the ruble-yuan exchange rate and cash flow problems. Due to cash shortages, Avtovaz workers are being forced to take leave. As consumer demand falls, fringe benefits such as childcare services and company health clinics have been suspended, and social satisfaction surveys have hit rock bottom. This is a fracture that goes beyond the automotive industry and touches on public psychology. The picture is not encouraging on the military supply side either. In Uralvagonzavod's first quarter report for 2025, the production target for T-90M tank hulls remained at 72%. They cannot source the steel product externally, and domestic production requires a vacuum melting furnace to achieve the same hardness-toughness balance. The furnace's graphite electrode is stuck in the Italian supply chain. When the electrode leaks, furnace regeneration takes longer and the main line drops to minimum operating speed. The result: delays in the production of tank hulls, artillery wedges, and pallet steel. While total tank output is falling, even spare parts cannot be delivered to frontline repair workshops. The Kremlin is trying to fill this gap with the rhetoric of Eurasian alternative exports. But foreign trade data paints a picture of one-sided dependence on China. According to customs reports, imports of electronic components from China in the first half of this year appear to have increased by 58% compared to 2024. Among these are dual-use FPGA chips that can be adapted for civilian and military use. However, Chinese manufacturers are demanding a 30% advance payment to counter the ruble's fluctuations. As the foreign exchange shortage grows, securing advance payments becomes more difficult, and shipments slow down. The Frontline feels where the chain is broken. Phase switch modules needed to repair S-400 batteries are arriving late, and battery backups are waiting in reserve. Ukraine's drone attacks are hitting that gap. Returning to the car market, foreign brands' hybrid vehicles are almost non-existent. A Shanghai-made SUV model cost 2.3 million rubles last year, but this year the price rose to 3.8 million because of the yuan exchange rate and increased logistics insurance costs. Russian consumers say, "The costs are high, let's wait." This wait is inflating Automov's inventory. The company is forced to launch a campaign, profit margins are falling, and the R&D budget is being cut. From here, a bridge to the defense sector. Part of the project financing for Uralvagonzavod's armored KMAZ platform was indirectly subsidized from AvtoVaz's profits. As profits shrink, Vagonzavod is forced to seek internal resources. The central bank's interest rates are high and credit costs are heavy. In other words, the civilian automotive downturn is having a ripple effect on the military truck project. This industrial collapse is hitting the Russian people's wallets with inflation and their backs with unemployment fears, while the railway and automotive crises are also affecting the front lines. After all, another item as important as artillery shells in the Ukraine war is the truck wagon rhythm. Severstal's Cherepovets steel cannot find wagons to transport iron ore from the Ural mines to the Luhansk internal lines, causing delays in the production of armor plates for field repair units. With no injection system available for diesel locomotive engines, convoys with reduced horsepower are arriving at the front instead of air-conditioned ammunition trains. The complaint frequently voiced in Russian defense blogs that ammunition is left at the station like stray mines while waiting for wagons actually sums up the logistical gridlock. The Kremlin tried to break this spiral with foreign currency injections. The $11.5 billion withdrawn from the National Wealth Fund for an industrial stimulus package was transferred to the Railway Industry Association and the Automotive Industry Development Fund at the end of July. But in return for the money, the machinery, software, chips and bearings are still not coming. Washington's sanctions package, which included the addition of Chinese-made but Western-licensed ERP software to the embargo list, paralyzed the digital supply systems of Russian factories. Some companies shut down their wireless networks for security reasons, switching to Excel spreadsheets to track orders. This return to the past is not out of nostalgia for Soviet-style planning, but simply because of the idea that we should track orders with as few documents as possible. However, modern automotive production lines depend on digital coding for on-time delivery. Even if the Excel spreadsheet is complete, if the truck body bolts are waiting in a Chinese warehouse for a renewed customs declaration, the assembly line still comes to a halt. A side effect of the economic turmoil is the rising premiums for international shipping insurance. Any container ship calling at a Russian port on the Baltic route doubles its insurance premium if it carries sensitive electronic cargo, because the policy includes a secondary sanctions risk. This cost is passed on to the part price at a rate of 15 to 20%. Additionally, containers entering Baltic ports face an extra half-day of customs checks. The digital declaration system remains closed in sanctions mode. As a result, Chinese-made ECUs are both expensive and delayed. When time-sensitive machinery sits idle, hourly depreciation costs skyrocket, fueling a second wave of ruble inflation. As the domestic market shrinks, the Kremlin's return to exports tactic is not working. The Western market is closed, China and India are producing their own cars and wagons, and selling vehicles to Africa with ruble loans sounds good, but goods cannot be shipped without insurance and shipping documents. The journey to Nigeria takes 45 days with local currency fluctuations and customs duties as high as freight costs upon arrival. While the Russian trade attaché says, "We will sell laders to Africa," workers at the assembly line are sent home without even changing their tools. On the other side of the coin is brain drain. More than 500,000 young professionals, especially those working in engineering, IT and technical fields, have left the country. These are the people who could repair the collapsed transportation infrastructure and revive the railway and automotive sectors. But now, Most of them are building new lives for themselves in a software office in Istanbul or by starting a startup in Tbilisi. The situation is even more alarming for those who remain in the country. Critical professions such as railway maintenance technician, welder, or automotive engineer are no longer economically or socially appealing to young people. Vocational high schools that were once bustling are now struggling with empty classrooms. Insufficient resources are hindering quality education. Some schools have closed down completely. Moreover, the current workforce is aging rapidly. As experienced craftsmen retire from these fields that young people are not interested in, there is no one to replace them. Wages have remained stagnant for years, working conditions are harsh, and the future is uncertain. The result, Russia is struggling to find the hands to repair its infrastructure, due to both the human capital lost through brain drain and the aging and shrinking workforce at home. Every corridor that closes is a step toward destruction. Putin risked the railways for war dividends. Now, the walls of the labyrinth are closing in. While Western analysts focus on tank numbers and troop positions, Siberian rails are rusting. Could Sun Tzu have predicted the war without mapping supply lines? Strategic planners must monitor rail widths with the same precision as missile silos. A state that cannot protect its rails loses its sovereignty. If Moscow's eastern flank collapses from a lack of supplies, will NATO's Black Sea fleets matter? When Belarus backs down, Polish rails swallow up a third of Russian exports, forcing Russia to launch ferry services in the Baltic Sea. When we put all the pieces together, a single picture emerges. The disruption in Russia's military-civilian industrial complex has now transformed into a unified crisis area, affecting not only new weapons production, but also domestic consumption, regional employment, and the foreign exchange balance. Railway congestion is slowing down the flow of ammunition to the front lines, as well as export revenues. The slowdown in the automotive sector is reducing civilian demand and depriving the military-industrial complex of funding. High interest rates are making borrowing expensive for both companies and households. Social discontent is growing, and the skilled young population is fleeing. In the short term, the Kremlin will attempt to keep the system afloat through new tax deferrals, mandatory domestic borrowing, and Chinese loans. But if the logistical bottlenecks and technology embargo are not resolved, the recession could be felt as a cumulative GDP decline of more than 5% in 2026. This would significantly reduce the defense budget in real terms and make the financial sustainability of the war questionable. No matter how long Russian decision-makers delay the domestic consumption defense spending trade-off, the rust on the rails, the halt in production, and the value of the ruble will ultimately lead to the same outcome. Without sustainable supply at the front, it is impossible to maintain strategic initiative. Current data indicates that we are rapidly approaching that critical threshold. Thank you for watching. Putin had pinned his hopes for land superiority in Ukraine on steel-armored convoys, but now Swedish-made bonus shells are crushing that superiority. Fired from 35 kilometers away, they rise, scan, and silently collapse into the weakest point of the armor. So how does bonus break Russia's armored line? Ukrainian artillery officers on the front lines tried Javelin NLAW AT-2 mine lines, kamikaze drones, and even Soviet-era Krasnopol ammunition to stop Russian armored reinforcements. All of them worked to a certain extent. However, the problem of limited range and narrow target spectrum could not be solved. When you hit the first vehicle of a tank battalion, the convoy stops, the rear vehicles maneuver backwards and wait, and the crew, having gained time, throw smoke grenades and hide. At such moments, the entire classic anti-tank guidance chain is disabled. If you lose sight of the target, if the GPS guidance of the munitions deviates, or if the radar controlling the firing is defeated by atmospheric conditions, even if the first strike is successful, the second and third targets will have already left their positions. In other words, a momentary blind spot means missing the entire opportunity. The Swedish-made bonus tank round steps in precisely at this critical point, becoming the bane of Russian armored vehicles. It has quickly become the signature, beyond the range tank killer of the Ukrainian artillery. The bonus is not a conventional tank round. It is a small, floating reconnaissance killer platform carrying two-part smart submunitions. When the shell leaves the barrel, the classic NATO propellant charge provides a fixed ballistic trajectory up to 35 kilometers. Once the ascent phase is complete, the nose modest cover of the casing opens, and the two sub-discs separate via micro-explosions from the lateral thrust cartridges, deploying their mini parachutes. The discs spin at 9 revolutions per second, beginning to scan the terrain below. One disc scans in a spiral pattern from left to right, while the other scans in a spiral pattern from right to left. Each disc houses an embedded electronic module containing an infrared matrix sensor, a LiDAR scanner, and a high-speed processor on its underside. The sensors first emit a heat signature to identify metal mass points by filtering out ambient noise, then use silhouette parameters to distinguish target types such as T-72, T-90, BMP-3, BTR-82, and Kamaz-based supply trucks. The algorithm only activates the explosive subtimer when it confirms that the detected target is an armored vehicle or a critical logistics transport vehicle. It automatically ignores worthless targets such as ordinary SUVs, pickup trucks, agricultural tractors, or piles of scrap metal. When the algorithm is triggered, the cast copper cone inside the projectile explodes in microseconds, flattening itself and creating an Arlington Silver Shield-type explosive shape charge. This penetrating warhead travels at a speed exceeding 2,000 kilometers per second at a right angle to the target. Even in the Russian army's most advanced tanks, such as the T-90M, the upper armor thickness generally does not exceed 45 millimeters of steel. Russia was able to distract waves of javelins and kamikaze drones with smoke mortars, but neither smoke nor cover is of any use against Bonus, which selects its targets using vibrating LiDAR and infrared scanning. This level of armor is particularly vulnerable to threats from above. When the explosive charge of a munition like Bonus strikes the target at a right angle, it penetrates the armor. The penetrating warhead reaches the munition rack or engine compartment beneath the armor, creating a high-pressure blast wave. This explosion disables the tank's internal systems. In most cases, the vehicle catches fire suddenly, or the crew loses consciousness due to the shock effect. The targeted armored vehicles are rendered combat ineffective due to both the risk of fire and the collapse of internal mechanisms. The entire process is completed within 25 to 30 seconds after the projectile leaves the barrel. The firing coordinates are determined not by the artillery radar, but by the disc's own learned dataset. Therefore, GPS jamming, GLONASS interference, or the Krastka 4 electronic jamming system cannot access Bonus's decision algorithm. Ukraine first tested Bonus ammunition in the fall of 2023 against a Russian armored column deployed near Toretsk in the Donetsk region. The target included 3 BMP-2 armored combat vehicles known for their weak upper armor. Footage recorded immediately after the attack showed that a new era had begun on the battlefield. The turrets of the BMP suddenly detached from the hull and flew into the air, while the upper hulls of the vehicles, now engulfed in flames, shattered like a can opened by an explosion. Each turret had an almost symmetrical circular hole in the center. With a diameter of 10 to 12 centimeters, this mark resembled a saucer and was the sign of a kinetic attack that came not from the outside, but directly from above and at a right angle. The shrapnel scattered on the side panels documented the secondary damage caused by the lower munitions during the explosion. Analysts pointed out that only one system could leave such a mark, an EFP, which is targeted from above and uses a point-impact-shaped explosive. Shoulder-fired guided missiles such as the Javelin leave a wider conical damage pattern because they operate with a tandem warhead, while sub-munition systems such as Bonus rain down millimeter-sized death in confined spaces. Just 7 days after this first successful attempt, another Russian unit moving south of Svatove, in the north of the Luhansk Oblast, was targeted. This time, the target was a convoy of command vehicles, including BMP-3 armored personnel carriers and T-80 BVM tanks, one of the most advanced tanks in the inventory. Videos recorded by Ukrainian forces in the area during the attack revealed a critical fact. There was no drone footage or incoming missile trail. Cameras only managed to capture the sudden appearance of umbrella-like explosions from above, which embedded themselves into the metal hull within seconds and detonated. At that point, French sources quietly conveyed the message. Along with the deployed Caesar batch, we also sent a limited number of bonus units. In December 2024, the Swedish government announced a $295 million aid package. The delivery list included 48 Archer self-propelled howitzers along with multi-purpose precision 155mm ammunition. Notes leaked to the Stockholm Defense Committee stated that Archer batteries will be packaged with at least 1,000 bonus munitions. Following this, the signatures on the front lines continued to increase. The Oryx team, which collects Russian armored statistics, added the phrases vertical penetration from above, high temperature traces, internal explosion, to 41 of the 176 tanks destroyed in the first 5 months of 2025, and marked a significant portion of these as having been hit by bonus. Russia tried to launch a classic counter-battery process against bonus. By the time the Zoopark 1M radars tracked the launch trail of the howitzer rocket and found its firing range, Caesar or Archer had already changed positions. This is because both platforms retract their hydraulic struts in 40 seconds after firing and can retreat 500 meters. By the time Zoopark's second radar scanned, the new bonus missile was already in the air. Due to its low wavelength heat signature and the fact that it does not require GPS coordinates at the start of its ballistic trajectory, the Murmansk BN and Krasuka 4 jammer networks were ineffective. The sensor's remaining disk fragment makes its own decision using its internal computer and does not rely on external signals. The EPOHA Hard Kill Active Protection Package has been tested on T-90Ms since the summer of 2024, but EPOHA cannot find the right angle to hit the EFP coming from above. The radar antenna is on the side of the hull. The projectile approaching the turret roof appears and strikes in 0.2 seconds, and the APS cannot fire at a top-down range. Every active system they use, such as Afghanit or Arena M, has side-front-rear approach sensors and cannot trigger kinetic countermeasures in vertical strikes. Reactive armor plates cannot be installed due to the weight and ergonomics of the tank roof. The situation is even more dire for armored personnel carriers. The BMP-3's roof is 15 mm thick, and the BTR-82's is 7 mm thick. EFP rounds slice through them like butter. Bonus's logistics also give Kiev a significant advantage. The 155 mm NATO artillery line is available in Ukraine, with the M777 and Archer, and the Danish-Norwegian-German-made PZH-2000 is ready in friendly countries. Since a bonus round is standardized in the supply chain, it doesn't matter which country it's shipped from, and the firing structure doesn't matter whether it's Caesar or Archer. The cost per round is around $110,000. If 3 rounds destroy 2 tanks and 1 armored recovery vehicle, Russia's loss exceeds $5 to $6 million. The cost multiplier is in favor by a factor of 15 to 20. The Sweden-France partnership uses suppliers from the Netherlands and Italy for optical sensors and LiDAR chips in the ammunition, with the production line under sanctions protection and a weekly capacity of 300 units. Stockholm included a clause in the delivery agreement granting ammunition priority for Archer batteries for 3 years. This reduces Kiev's concerns about stockpiling in its firing cycle planning. The tactical impact on the front lines is more significant than the numbers suggest. When Russian armored columns enter the terrain, they are no longer just afraid of Javelin teams, but also of a French-Swedish howitzer battery located 30 kilometers behind, mounted on a truck bed. Even if the tank driver looks at the trees and the line of elevation, the 2 discs above glide silently. No parachute sound is heard. But when the EFP hits the turret cover, a shockwave is felt. Due to this psychological pressure, Russian tank crews frequently hide in the forest, take winding routes, and reduce their speed, despite orders not to abandon the night convoy. ISW reports indicate that by June 2025, the speed of Russian armored columns in the Liman-Siversk corridor had dropped from 6 kilometers per day to 2.5 kilometers per day. Ukrainian reconnaissance drone recordings indicate that most of the delay is due to convoy disarray caused by fear of an overhead attack. The Russian side has conducted experiments under the heading bonus countermeasure, including adding passive composite shields to turret roofs, stretching armored mesh nets, and using smoke generators to disperse roof heat signatures. But since the disk sensor combines heat, shape, and LiDAR return data, smoke and nets only cause delays and are not very effective in the end. Placing a heat source next to the tank was also suggested, but the EFP's directional explosion still focuses on the actual silhouette. The newly developed Russian Krypta M jammer was added to the gun barrel and attempted to disrupt the disk sensor with a microwave signal emitted at the muzzle. However, the chance of the bonus shot coinciding with the jammer in the same battery barrel was low, and it was not practical. The political repercussions of the Sweden-Ukraine cooperation became clear when combined with Stockholm's process of joining NATO. The Stockholm Ministry of Defense stated that our support to Ukraine in the form of long-range artillery and smart munitions is preparation for NATO defense industry integration. In a sense, the bonus shipment is a practical demonstration of Swedish industry's commitment to the Atlantic Alliance. It is also strategic for France. In October 2024, Emmanuel Macron mentioned the idea of joint production with Kiev on the Nexter KNDS line. If bonus's performance on the battlefield is confirmed to be as high as reported, plans are in place to establish a joint 155mm smart munitions workshop in the Ukraine-Poland-Lithuania triangle. This would mean local production capacity on the eastern flank. Paris has already provided funding for an artillery maintenance and repair center in Ukraine following Caesar sales, and the bonus production license could be transferred gradually. Russian media claims that Kiev has turned into an open testing ground for Western arms companies. But the side suffering tank losses on the battlefield is bearing the brunt of the psychological strain. Another consequence of bonus is a change in counter-battery radar tactics. Ukraine fires and quickly changes position, and Russian radar tracks the angle and fires Grad or Smerch missiles at the estimated point. But Caesar's shoot-scoop profile and Archer's fully automatic loading mechanism cannot be countered. They change position before they are within radar range. 2 more rounds follow, and the radar cannot locate the source again. This cycle depletes Russian ammunition stocks, while counter-battery fire that cannot hit its target causes minimal damage to Ukraine, tilting the cost-effectiveness balance in Kiev's favor. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is using bonus not only as a tank hunter, but also as an area clearer before critical bridge crossings. In December 2024, 3 bonus shells were fired at a convoy of old T-62mm and T-55M mine clearance tanks of various sizes, as they advanced on a network of forest roads west of Chasiv Yar. Within minutes, 6 vehicles were destroyed, and the rest were forced to abandon the road and leave their heavy equipment behind. The following night, Ukrainian infantry crossed the forest and pushed the dynamic front line back 800 meters. With no armored vehicles left to clear the area, Russian troops tried to clear the minefield by hand the next day, but it took them 6 hours to reach the gap in the front line. Those 6 hours were enough for the Ukrainian defense to dig new trenches. The indirect effect of ammunition is sometimes greater than that of EFPs themselves. Bonus has not yet shown its full potential on the coastal front, as the areas along the Black Sea coast are open and there is little armored convoy traffic. But news of the success of the bonus version with hydroacoustic scanning in Swedish tests is causing excitement in Kiev. If the ER variant is provided, even mobile railway locomotives such as the Crimean land bridge reinforcement line and the Rostov-Don tunnel connection could be struck from above. The ER version's disc uses a phased array micro-radar instead of LiDAR, can distinguish between metal and concrete, and does not require a thermal signature. The Swedish Defence Industry Agency plans to deliver the first batch of this variant by early 2026. Contract negotiations between Stockholm and Kiev have already begun. Russia's tank loss data is not officially disclosed, but Oryx and Dutch open-source teams have recorded 5,913 visually confirmed tank losses as of the end of July 2025. 7% of these are reported to have top EFP traces. Losses on the ground are likely higher. If bonus shipments increase and their use is synchronized with Archer and Caesar batteries, this percentage could quickly double. The number of modern tanks like the T-90M and T-80BVM is already limited. Soviet-era T-62 and T-55 tanks in reserve have little chance of withstanding bonus. If the Ukrainian General Staff maintains the average of 1 bonus round neutralizing 1 tank, it is projected that Russian mechanized assaults will be significantly slowed down throughout the fall. Ultimately, the bonus ammunition not only brings the cutting edge of Swedish-French defense technology to Kiev, but also strikes at the very weak point of Russian armored doctrine. Unless tank turrets are thickened, active protection systems become fully responsive to direct hits, or APS sensors are updated with a 360-degree upper sensor ring, Moscow will be unable to prevent mass casualties. Production speeds cannot keep pace with losses. Each destroyed modern tank triggers an industrial cycle that takes 3 years to replace it. Sweden's transfer of Archer howitzers and bonus ammunition is therefore not merely a technical matter, but a strategic link binding Ukraine firmly to Northern Europe in the field of artillery engineering. This offensive vector, which strengthens Kiev's hand in the smart artillery age, adds new pieces of heavy scrap metal to the Donbass plains and the Luhansk heights every day. With each EFP strike, the myth of Russian armor's invulnerability thins by a few millimeters. Thank you for watching. When you put pressure on manned aircrafts, the JSC Progress plant in Michurinsk was another sensitive target. It is a small but sophisticated electronic facility. It was one of the country's rare technology bases producing guidance mechanisms for Russian artillery systems, aircraft autopilots, and missile control systems. Guidance kits for artillery shells are pressed here. Parts for the autopilot systems of Su-34 aircraft are also produced here. Components serving the gas and oil infrastructure were also produced here. The attack dealt a heavy blow to both the military and civilian industries. American sources reported that 1,800 tons of artillery ammunition were rendered unusable as a result of this attack alone, causing losses of approximately 8 billion rubles. However, the critical point is not the overall toll, but the precision strike capability. Without guided artillery shells, the Russian military is forced to revert to its old habits, namely the blind firing logic. Blind firing reduces damage per rocket, but increases ammunition consumption. As stockpiles already dwindle, a drop in accuracy will erode morale and logistics simultaneously. So far, we have mentioned 4 critical targets. However, the picture is not bright for the rest of the chain either. The Azot chemical plant in the Tula region was a critical link in the supply chain for military-grade explosives. Ukraine's attack on this facility directly increased the production pressure on artillery ammunition and led to a significant decline in stockpile levels. The production of explosive intermediates at the Azot chemical plant in Tula has been reduced to 50% of capacity for the time being. The Savazleyka airfield ammunition depot in the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast was not only a logistics facility, but also a base for MiG-31Ks. The drone attack on the depot disrupted the Air Force's readiness. It was reported that the flight tempo dropped significantly following the attack. The Kazan gunpowder factory was one of the key ammunition sources in Tatarstan. Explosive production at this facility was of vital importance for both ground forces and the Air Force. The attack was seen as part of a systematic effort to undermine Russia's ammunition backbone. The Sverdlov factory in Nizhny Novgorod was an advanced technology center producing warheads and components for anti-aircraft missiles. The success achieved there directly impacted Russia's production capacity for short-range defense systems. The Lipetsk II airbase was a strategic hub housing tactical attack aircraft such as the Su-34 and Su-35. The drone attack on the ammunition depot disrupted the ammunition rotation of combat aircraft, slowing down operational tempo. And perhaps the most symbolic target was the Yelabuga drone factory. This facility, where Iranian-made Shahed drones are manufactured, was the direct source of the systems used to attack Ukrainian cities during the war. Now let's take a step back and look at the macro impact of the entire list of attacks. In a matter of weeks, 10 vital factories in Russia were hit. These attacks are putting Russia's defense industry under pressure on 3 fronts. First, there is the direct loss of production. Second, there is the gap that emerges during the repair period. Third, there is the psychological and economic multiplier effect. The burning of Rezonit cuts not only chemical oil stocks but also tanker logistics. The transport company is increasing its insurance premium by 20% due to the risk of flammable substances. This additional cost is not reflected in defense supplies, but even in the diesel bills of civilian truckers. The problem is that the Kremlin cannot compensate for this production shift with other lines. Extra shifts have been added in Kazan for gunpowder, but even there, infrastructure capacity is at 90% of national production. Some of the raw materials come from Belarus. As the destruction grows, the Belarusian line cannot keep up. Attempts are being made to source chemical components from India, but long shipping times and high reinsurance costs are driving up costs. China wants to be brought in for hydraulic oil, but Chinese manufacturers are demanding tough contract guarantees due to the possibility of secondary sanctions. This puts the exchange rate risk of the ruble-yuan swap on Moscow's shoulders. At this point, let's take a look at which countries Russia is seeking support from. Iran is at the top of the list. Shahed bodies come from Iran. However, the actuator cards and telemetry modules required for assembly were manufactured in Russia. This balance was disrupted after the Cheboksary fire. The Kremlin offered Tehran to switch to complete box, ready-to-fly deliveries. The price discussed is around $100,000 per unit. Iran has a production line, but it is also depleting its drone stockpile amid regional tensions. Supply is limited. The second line is China. Chinese suppliers are being approached, particularly for synthetic motor oil and special machine bearings. However, fears of secondary sanctions are putting the brakes on this. Payment in rubles is being proposed to Chinese companies. The exchange rate risk is borne by the Kremlin. In addition, freight costs are skyrocketing as the logistics route extends the Siberian corridor. The third backdoor is North Korea. Pyongyang is demanding food and energy supplies from Russia in exchange for increasing capacity on its 152mm artillery shell production line. Korean shells comply with Soviet standards. However, South Korean intelligence is passing documents showing shipments to the United Nations, and the sanctions file is expanding. Each new sanction narrows Russia's currency swap options. India and Turkey are two pivots in the Kremlin's vision of neutral partners. Russia is offering India discounted crude oil in exchange for engineering equipment or financial swaps. New Delhi is not openly selling military parts, but it is leaving the door open for imports of intermediate chemicals and steel press molds. In return, India wants heavy discounts of the first 20 years to the journey over questions of his. Turkey is a transit bridge in terms of port logistics. However, Ankara does not want to remain in a grey area in terms of Western sanctions, so it divides trade into open and closed lines. Goods on the open line are very limited, while parts coming from the closed line require procedural games such as changing customs codes and trimming the origin. In other words, it is risky and expensive. All these concessions and dependencies cast a shadow over the great power narrative. Russia's bargaining power is diminishing as it is forced into a chain of regional alliances. China says, "We will send additional equipment, but you must reduce the price of natural gas." Iran is demanding, "If you want more Shahed drones, expand the Caspian oil swap." North Korea is responding with, "We'll give you artillery shells in exchange for food and technology." In short, the Kremlin is beginning to make economic concessions in exchange for strategic prestige. What is happening economically? The Russian economy is struggling to bear the costs of the war, and every disruption in the production chain creates an even greater burden. Production disruptions are continuing due to attacks on defense facilities. At the same time, drone attacks on rail and road lines transporting ammunition and fuel to the front are causing delays in transportation. These delays are increasing logistics costs and disrupting supplies to the front lines. The heightened risk perception in the war environment is driving up reinsurance premiums, i.e., insurance and reinsurance costs. Aircraft, trains and cargo ships are no longer considered normal assets, but are now classified as assets carrying military risk. This is causing transportation insurance premiums to skyrocket. At the same time, access to Western technology has been cut off by embargoes, forcing Russia to produce the parts it needs domestically. This increases import substitution. However, low productivity drives up costs. When all these factors come together, the picture is clear. The Russian economy's need for foreign currency and rubles is increasing. Under this pressure, defense spending is growing even more. Russia's military budget now accounts for 8.6% of its gross domestic product. But at the same time, the tax base is shrinking as the economy shrinks, the workforce is diverted to the war effort, and production capacity declines. State tax revenues are crumbling like sawdust. The central bank is intervening to prop up the hollowed-out ruble by selling foreign currency and raising interest rates. But the real economy is paying the price for these measures. High interest rates are multiplying the cost of credit for small and medium-sized enterprises and destroying the prospects for new investment. All of this has a knock-on effect that is felt directly in people's pockets. The Consumer Price Index announced in June rose by 2.4% on a monthly basis. When annualized, this rate shows that inflation has reached 45%. It is also necessary to mention the psychological dimension that these deep hit-and-run moves have created within Russia. The central bank is selling $100 million a day to support the ruble. As foreign exchange reserves dwindle, the institution is narrowing the repo window. The policy rate is 21%. SME loans are over 30%. High interest rates are curbing production, but inflation is not falling because the supply-side shock is not over. On one hand, the price of gunpowder. On the other, the price of motor oil. And on yet another, the price of truck insurance. All of these are reflected as price hikes on bread, eggs, and phones. Here is a critical statement. Russia's defense spending has exceeded 8.5% of GDP. Meanwhile, the economy is shrinking and the tax base is narrowing. State revenues are crumbling like sawdust. This contradiction is intriguing because historically, economies that allocate a third of their budget to military and security spending cannot remain stable for long. The Soviet Union of the 1980s is a case in point. The National Wealth Fund has long served as a crisis cushion. Now, as money in this oil-dependent fund dwindles, defense spending is reaching record levels. Financial circles are increasingly warning that liquid reserves could run out by the fall of 2025. In such a situation, the Kremlin faces a clear choice: either cut social spending even further or freeze the defense budget. Both options will create friction in domestic politics. Against this backdrop, passport queues are growing in Moscow. Young people working in the software, finance, and engineering sectors in particular are under pressure to switch to a remote working model but leave the country. Passport applications increased by 190% in May-June. According to the Interior Ministry's database, 280,000 people left the country and did not return in the first 6 months of the year. While brain drain is directly eroding the tax base, the technology ecosystem is also being shaken. So why has Ukraine deepened this strategy? First, changing the balance of artillery ammunition on the front line now depends on cutting off deep logistics centers. Kiev's internal reports estimate that Russia is filling its border arsenals with 200,000 rounds of ammunition per month, but that if centers such as Tambov are destroyed, the speed of delivery will decrease by 35%. Second, when oil and chemical plants are hit, the effect on inflation is based on morale rather than the ruble. In the 3 days following the Rezonit fire, motor oil prices rose by 11% in major retail chains. If people pull their cars out of garages, logistics companies will struggle to find drivers, leading to a chain reaction of rising food prices. The economic shock is even more stark when viewed through the numbers on the table. The Russian National Wealth Fund is now pointing to serious difficulties. Financial sustainability, once the Kremlin's mantra, has given way to triage. The Ministry of Finance, which has been forced to revise its 2025 budget, now expects a deficit of 3.8 trillion rubles, more than the initial deficit of 1.17 trillion. Oil and gas revenues, the lifeblood of the Russian state, fell by 10% on an annual basis and collapsed by 34% in May alone. While this month's surprising rise in Ural's crude oil prices will bring some money into the fund, the NWF, once a symbol of prudence, still serves as a warning. The NWF's decline is not an isolated incident. It is at the heart of Russia's financial desperation. Russia's 2025 budget allocates a record $130.5 billion for defense, overshadowing all other priorities. Western sanctions have prevented Russia from borrowing abroad and forced it to deplete its own reserves. External debt dropped from $729 billion in 2023 to $293 billion in September 2024. Once a shield against foreign pressure, the NWF now stands as a monument to self-imposed isolation. Beyond all this, the economic devastation caused by Ukraine's attacks is also weighing heavily on Russia's shoulders. Not only on the military front, but also on the financial front, Moscow is bending a little more with each explosion. Ukraine's 10 strikes have exposed that the heart of the Russian war machine is actually being patched up with rotten patches. When the powder keg goes off, the gun falls silent. When the chip line burns, the missile goes blind. When the fuel tank explodes, the tank's piston seizes up. Will the Kremlin respond to this micro-lethal world with a macro-nuclear threat? Or will it recognize the unsustainable cost threshold and sit down at the negotiating table? The answer lies in how many gunpowder drums, electronic press lines, and barrels of weapon oil Moscow can keep operational by the same date next year. Because modern warfare is no longer measured in milestones, but in the precision of integrated circuits. And that precision is eroded with every drone buzz. Thank you for watching. International routes such as Moscow-Istanbul and Moscow-Dubai, which remain open, face the risk of insurance coverage being cancelled until a new database is established. Insurance brokers reported that, as of July 29th, Aeroflot's flight-based premiums had increased by 82%, with some reinsurance companies even withdrawing entirely. The daily premium increase per aircraft averages $145,000, making it the second largest expense after fuel costs. If the additional costs are passed on to ticket prices, domestic flights will fall below the break-even point. If not, the company will incur monthly losses of millions of dollars. The economic damage from the attack is not limited to the aviation sector. Commercial air cargo in Russia carried 631,000 tons in the first 6 months of 2025. VAT, customs and logistics commissions provide significant revenue to the central budget. Due to the disruption in Moscow, customs exit manifests could not be digitally verified, and goods exports were suspended for 3 days. Pharmaceutical shipments, sterile laboratory equipment, and special automotive parts being transported in refrigerated containers were delayed, prompting logistics companies to switch to emergency road transport. Fuel price hikes and transit permit delays created a chain reaction of costs. According to the Ministry of Finance's internal analysis note over the weekend, the 3-day collapse alone points to indirect tax losses of 98.4 billion rubles and the risk of export delay penalties. Silent Crow, which claimed responsibility for the attack, stated in its first manifesto, "Any entity using Russian airspace to transport military cargo under the guise of civilian transport is our target." Claims that the Kremlin had recently transferred military ammunition and drone parts to the Azov and Donbass fronts via civilian cargo planes were already included in Western intelligence reports. This statement explains the strategic motivation behind the action. Every time Ukrainian ground forces feel pressure on the front lines, a digital axe striking the flight network behind them delays Russian resupply and slows down the pace of fire on the ground. Moreover, this cyber attack was not a routine IT failure, but part of a larger plan. The attack carried out in Crimea on July 26th was not merely a hacking attempt, but a digital invasion. The operation, planned by Ukrainian military intelligence and executed by Ukrainian cyber forces, began with an intense DDoS attack. As a result, the information systems purportedly belonging to the so-called Crimean Republic were paralyzed. Regional administrations, district centers, and administrative units were plunged into digital darkness. Amid the chaos created by this first wave, Ukrainian cyber experts quietly infiltrated the target systems and spent 2 days scanning all digital infrastructure under Russian control. The sheer volume of the data obtained was staggering. Over 100 terabytes of information, which was not only massive in size, but also highly sensitive in content. The leaked files included logistics plans, military deployment data, regional communication infrastructure details, and even information about underground tunnels and fuel transfer points. Critically important software systems such as the Electronic Document Management Systems, Dialog Crimea, SED and DELO, as well as the 1C document management, Directum and Atlas platforms were completely shut down. The Ukrainian team did not just extract the data, they destroyed the systems to leave no trace behind. In other words, not only was the data leaked, but the digital memory was completely erased. The consequences were not limited to the cyber realm. In occupied Crimea, the internet infrastructure has been intermittently disrupted for weeks. Public services, population records, access to financial data, and even some civil administrative functions have been rendered unusable. This meant the collapse of the occupation administration in digital terms. Crimea is the main logistics hub for Russia's Black Sea garrison, supplying fuel and supporting S-400 and coastal defense batteries. Kyiv's traditional missile strikes were already putting pressure on bridges and the Saki airbase. The digital destruction struck the other end of the chain. The Russian Black Sea Fleet switched to using the Novorossiysk backup database to process its current flight plan data. This move means that night flight plans and ground service messages cannot be shared simultaneously. Former naval flight officers who remember the paper-based processes of 15 years ago have prepared kilometers of documents in file folders. Crew members admit they have regressed to the Soviet paper era. The digital collapse is also highlighted as weakening defenses against the risk of sabotage at sea. There is no automation in map updates, AIS station updates, or backup of radar track records, increasing the likelihood of human error. The Kremlin issued harsh statements against the attack from the outset. While the Russian parliament described the incident as a new phase of hybrid warfare, officials in Crimea admitted that most of the regional administrations were still offline. But the real impact of the incident was psychological and strategic. Despite being a state crushed by international sanctions and the heavy burden of war, Ukraine managed to expose the weak underbelly of a global power like Russia in the information war. This operation was not only a military victory, but also a milestone in terms of digital sovereignty. Ukraine proved that it could challenge a superpower with determination and operational intelligence, without large infrastructures, billion-dollar budgets, or supercomputers. Moreover, the domino effect of this cyber victory is inevitable. The administrative collapse in Crimea undermined confidence in data security not only in that region, but also in the entire occupation. In June, cyber units affiliated with Ukrainian military intelligence not only stole information by infiltrating Gazprom's internal systems, but also shut down all data flows in the system, rendering the infrastructure inoperable and effectively closing hundreds of facilities. This attack showed the whole world what it means to digitally shut down a giant industrial organism that runs on natural gas. The targeted system was not just a central data repository. According to her sources, Ukrainian cyber experts infiltrated Gazprom's internal networks after weeks of preparation. Once inside, they spread the operation over time. Hundreds of terabytes of data were copied, thousands of servers were mapped, and then systematically taken down. Approximately 20,000 system administrators had their access revoked at once, meaning that Gazprom's digital backbone could not be managed even by its own staff. Nearly 390 subsidiaries and branches were directly affected by this chain reaction. The data seized was not limited to customer information. State-backed energy sales contracts, internal communications related to tax evasion, SCADA control panels regulating gas flow, well production reports and pressure and flow analytics, shipment schedules to Europe, and documents detailing fund transfers directly linked to the Kremlin were all seized. Traditional deletion commands were deemed insufficient to damage the system. The Ukrainian cyber unit used a wiper software requiring high-level expertise. This software not only disabled operating systems but also penetrated servers at the BIOS level, rendering the hardware permanently unusable. In other words, these machines were physically sabotaged to the point where they cannot be restarted without on-site repairs. The effects of this attack spread in a chain reaction. Gazprom Teplo Energo, Gazprom Obel Energo, and Gazprom Energosbit, critical subsidiaries of Gazprom, lost a significant portion of their services, ranging from city heating systems to gas distribution, electricity production, and logistics transfer systems. Thousands of industrial facilities and residential buildings, particularly in Russia's western regions, experienced severe disruptions in gas supply. And here's the critical point. Gazprom is not just an ordinary energy company, it is the cornerstone of Vladimir Putin's geopolitical projection. The natural gas Gazprom sells to Europe is one of the Kremlin's levers of influence over the West. The company is also a huge financial pump that transfers billions of dollars into the state coffers every year. Therefore, the blow dealt to Gazprom was not only economic damage, but also a direct attack on Russia's diplomatic and strategic influence. Three fundamental weaknesses stand out as to why Russia's cyber defense was so exposed. First, there is a shortage of up-to-date network security equipment due to import controls that have been in place since 2022. Most high-level firewalls, next-generation intrusion detection sensors, and air-gap laptops require Western-made chips and firmware. The Kremlin tried to replace them through China and Taiwan, but the analogs were inadequate due to delays, poor compatibility, and a lack of spare parts. Second, there is a shortage of skilled human resources. Young engineers are seeing their salaries erode under the war budget and are leaving the country, Most of those who remain are either preoccupied with avoiding compulsory military service or are struggling with low motivation within outdated structures. Third, management culture. Russian public institutions tend to hide problems rather than report them in times of crisis. This delays the transmission of information to higher authorities, even if the symptoms of an attack are detected early, thereby prolonging the response time. For years, Putin's administration has fed the public with rhetoric about digital sovereignty. Projects such as the filtered internet known as Runet, the MirPay payment system, and the Aurora mobile operating system were presented as proof of independence. However, the recent cyberstorm has shaken the Kremlin's mantra of independence. Even one of the DNS root servers within Runet was unable to respond during the Aeroflot crisis. The processing center that manages MirPay needed external power support, and Aurora update servers were 6 hours late. In other words, the parts may be local, but the entire chain is still dependent on global components. Moscow has so far tried to downplay cyberattacks under the label of Anglo-Saxon hybrid warfare. Videos taken by passengers in front of darkened screens, however, have left this narrative without a leg to stand on. There is no smoke, no sirens, no traces of explosions in the images. Yet the country's #1 airline is on its knees. Those who carried out the attack did not fire rockets into the sky, but wrote lines of code, ran vulnerability scanners, and redirected packets. The result was as devastating as if a cruise missile had been prevented from taking off. For Putin, the destruction lies there. He has invested $600 billion in weapons modernization, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of missile systems. But a few people pressing keys on a keyboard can cut off the logistical arteries that move that body. In asymmetric warfare, the technology cost balance is tilted in Kiev's favor. If the doctrine does not change, this tilt will increase a little more each month. Thank you for watching. Railway networks in southern Russia are falling one by one. Everything is in flames, for 3 nights in a row. First Kamenolomny, then Volgograd, and now Salsk. What's more, these are the main arteries feeding Russia's war effort. Now Ukraine's drone attacks are targeting not just stations but the entire supply backbone. The rails that carry fuel, ammunition and soldiers to the southern front are no longer operational. Locomotives have fallen silent, and wagons are stranded mid-journey. If trains come to a halt in the war, can Russia advance on the front lines? On July 29th, Ukrainian attack drones targeted the city of Salsk in the Rostov region. This attack was directed at the Salsk railway station, one of the region's most critical logistics hubs. The targeted train was reported to be carrying military equipment, fuel and lubricants, making this junction vital for fuel and military supply traffic. The UAVs directly struck 2 tank cars and the locomotive of the train. The consequences of the attack were so devastating that they defy description. The moment the UAV hit the station was like an ammunition box exploding. A pillar of flame rose into the sky with the explosion. Black smoke rising from the burning carriages could be seen from miles away. The metal piles on the rails looked like they had melted. The station had been turned into a battlefield. Words alone cannot describe this scene. You have to see it to believe it. That is why we are sharing with you the images recorded by civilians who were at the scene immediately after the attack. But the attack was not limited to the railway. As part of the same operation, an electrical substation in the town of Orlovsky, about 56 kilometers from Salsk, was also targeted. This center supplied power to the railway lines around Salsk. The attack on the transformer station disrupted the power supply not only to the station, but to the entire regional railway line. The loss of electrification caused electric locomotives in the area to come to a halt and triggered chain delays in shipments. As a result of the attack, 18 passenger trains were delayed for over 7 hours. This attack was not an isolated act. It was the 3rd deep strike and run raid carried out in quick succession along the same corridor. On July 27th, the train station in the heart of Novocherkassk was hit, while on July 22nd, the Kamenolomny railway junction was targeted. Ukrainian General Staff spokesman Andriy Kovalenko said, "The ant trail supplying the southern front is now seriously bleeding in terms of ammunition, fuel and evacuation traffic," putting the 3 attacks in the same category. The Kremlin, however, claimed in its morning bulletin that 74 UAVs had been shot down and tried to downplay the attack. But the railway is the backbone of logistics for Russia, which transports the vast majority of its equipment and supplies by train. The Russian army carries out 70% of its land transport by rail. A glance at the map is enough to understand the strategic importance of the Rostov line. This location is the artery that pumps life into Russia's southern front. Tanks, armored carriers, ammunition shipments, fuel tankers, spare parts trucks, even funeral convoys. All of them pass through this railway network stretching from Donbass to the shores of the Azov Sea. Each machine train carries an average of 800 tons of ammunition, 300,000 liters of diesel fuel, and 17 armored vehicles to northern Donbass every day. Even a 5-hour stoppage at the station means that the depots in Tokmak and Melitopol will approach critical stock levels. Ukraine is relying on drones to achieve this. When it comes to the equipment components of the Ukrainian attack, Deputy Defense Minister Ivan Havriluk mentioned domestically produced one-way UAVs without official confirmation. Looking at the published images, we can see a drone with a wing structure similar to the Boba's body. The Boba family was designed based on the principles of low visibility and long range. Its fuselage is largely made of wood composite materials, which minimizes radar wave reflection. The average radar cross-section is only around 0.03 square meters, which is an extremely small target for modern air defense radars. For example, for the 92 N6E radars of the S-400 system, the probability of detecting a target of this size within a 35-kilometer range drops below 50%. In short, you notice the drone target approaching too late. Moreover, Boba is not just passive. It flies intelligently. Its dual navigation system, which operates using a combination of GPS-INS and GPS-out, is resistant to electronic jamming. Thanks to this system, it can fly parallel to tree lines and at very low altitudes, reaching its target outside the radar's field of view. Its ability to carry 90 kilograms of explosives means that even a single vehicle can cause serious damage to important infrastructure. You may be wondering what Russian air defense systems did in the face of this advanced technology. In fact, the much-praised Russian air defense systems did nothing. This is because at that moment, the air defense line around Salsk had serious gaps. The Tor M2U systems had been moved further south, toward the Crimean connection, due to increasing threats to Ukraine's Kerch and Chongar bridges. There were only a few Panzer S-1 batteries in the region. These systems have 6 launch tubes and can shoot down 2 drones per minute under ideal conditions. But they need a 3-minute gap to reload. This interval was enough for drones arriving in swarms to find their targets. There is more. Not only kinetic defense had collapsed, but electronic defense as well. The Signal Electronic Warfare Factory in Stavropol had previously been severely damaged in a similar Ukrainian attack. This facility was producing new jammer generators and signal jamming modules intended for deployment along the front lines. The halt in production at the facility weakened the electronic warfare protection umbrella in the region. Thus, before the new generation jammers capable of disrupting the Boba drone's GPS signals could reach the front lines, the drones were already in motion. All these factors combined enabled the attack on the Salsk junction in Rostov to succeed with almost no resistance. Ukraine not only acted technically, but also timed its move perfectly and exploited intelligence effectively. And Russia's critical supply backbone in the south has been shaken once again. Moreover, Ukraine achieved this through a low-cost, but frequently repeated and exhausting approach. It is technically possible to hit the same target with cruise missiles such as Storm Shadow, but this option is no longer attractive in terms of cost-benefit. A single Storm Shadow missile costs around $2 million, and there are only a limited number of these missiles available. However, when Ukraine struck a railway junction like Salsk with 4 Boba-type UAVs, it achieved the same effect at a total cost of only $100,000 to $120,000. Each of these drones carries a high explosive warhead, weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms. When precision strikes are made on target areas containing ammunition wagons, the resulting fires spread chain reaction style across the entire wagon train. This means that fuel or equipment wagons not directly targeted can also catch fire and even explode. In other words, a single explosion can cause operations at the station to completely collapse within a few minutes. But this tactical choice is not based solely on cost effectiveness. It is also part of a psychological and logistical siege plan. The strategy is very clear: to turn the railway network that brings life to Russia's front lines into a chronically damaged system that has to be constantly repaired. Ukraine's goal is to repeat the cycle of fire, wait for it to be extinguished, allow it to be repaired, strike again, as often as possible. This creates a nerve-wracking, vicious circle that consumes both infrastructure and human resources. Kiev's Logistics Command has restructured its weekly attack tempo with this in mind. The goal? To strike 6 to 8 critical logistical targets each week. This is not merely an operational plan, but a long-term model of attrition. If such a pace can be sustained, the railway backbone, stretching from Rostov to the southern front, will be rendered inoperable not just 3 days a week, but nearly 1 or 2 days every week. This not only disrupts transportation, but also systematically disrupts the Russian army's fuel, ammunition, and spare parts rotation. The Russian 8th Combined Arms Army, stationed on the Donetsk front, aimed to suppress Ukrainian defenses and gain ground by firing an average of 2,500 artillery shells per day throughout June 2025. This intense fire was particularly decisive in counter-battery warfare. This rhythm forced Ukraine's artillery batteries to frequently change positions, take cover, and use ammunition with caution. But the attacks changed the situation. Ammo shipments to the front were disrupted, and the 8th Army's daily firing rate dropped to 1,800. While this may sound like just a numerical decrease, the psychological and operational impact of this small difference on the battlefield is significant. First, this drop gave Ukraine's artillery a breather. As the frequency of attacks decreased, Ukrainian batteries were able to hold their positions for longer periods of time. Instead of moving, they are now focused on aiming. This directly increases the hit rate. More importantly, Ukraine can now use 155mm GPS-guided ammunition such as Kalibr much more efficiently. Kiev measures Russian fire intensity as a noise level, and, when this intensity decreases, reserves its precision munitions for more effective targets. Expensive, limited-quantity munitions like the Kalibr are now directed solely at critical targets: artillery command centers, ammunition depots, armored vehicle clusters, or radar systems. This allows the Ukrainian army to conserve ammunition and increase its effectiveness. This economy of ammunition is also changing the behavior of Russian defense forces. Previously, heavy fire on a specific point of the front line was a signal for Russian troops to move. But now that pressure has eased. Artillery support is delayed, suppression fire is weak, and this slows down position changes. Especially when execution fire is lacking, Russian units hesitate to launch an attack. These delays, based on morale and time, enable the Ukrainian defense to regain the initiative. It should not be forgotten that such attacks target not just a single railway line, but a multi-layered supply chain. The disruption originating from the Salsk node has spread not just to one region, but across the entire southern front. According to the Rostov Logistics Directorate's report, dated July 29th, 4 separate container routes arriving via Novocherkassk have been cancelled. This means that 36 40-ton cargo containers are stranded on the tracks. What's inside? According to the cargo manifests, thermal scopes, waterproof pallets, and 125mm tank shells. On the same day, a 12-carriage convoy departing from Volgodonsk was stranded on the tracks near Elista for 3 hours due to a signal failure. Satellite data showed that at least 5 fuel tankers were parked on side tracks along the same route for security reasons. Diesel fuel bound for Crimea powers not only tanks, but also generators, port cranes, and refrigerated logistics chains. When this flow is cut off, it is not only engines that stop, but entire systems. According to an analysis by Polymology Positions, every time the interruption is prolonged, it is not only the military wing that is disrupted, but also the wheels of civilian production. When refinery shipments from Rostov were delayed by 1 day, 4 different gas stations along the Tavrida highway reported nothing. Cashiers were issuing receipts, but the pumps were not working. This is not just a logistical war, but a war of perception. Of the 110,000 barrels flowing through, 40,000 are marked as the Army's secret reserve. Its halt means a return to an era when generals at the front calculate diesel needs on maps. Meanwhile, the Russian Railways' addition of a $7 war risk surcharge is pushing many private operators, especially small carriers, out of the system. The math is clear. Rising costs per wagon, plus the government's subsidy squeeze, will push freight prices up by 12% by the end of 2025. This increase will be reflected in flour prices for grain, bean costs for steel, and bread and rent for citizens. At this point, the question becomes clear. How flexible is Russia's war logistics, and how much can it take before it breaks? When the existing artery stretching from Volgograd to Crimea is cut off, the remaining route is a winding railway line through Kuban to the eastern coast of the Black Sea. However, this route is constrained by both structural and geographical limitations. Narrow tunnels, aging viaducts, and inadequate signaling systems reduce transportation efficiency. If Ukraine's Boba-type unmanned systems are deployed more densely around the Azov region, the bridges and crossings on this backup route will also come within range. When this happens, Russia's logistics will have to spread from the central backbone to rural arteries and then to unpaved secondary routes. This is not only a waste of time, thermal fuel consumption increases by up to 30%, and transport time doubles. When the fuel requirements of armoured divisions are factored in, a daily supply norm of 12,000 tons dropping to 8,000 tons would disrupt artillery battery firing schedules, delay ammunition distribution for TOS-1 and MSD-B systems, and shift operational intensity. Logistical disruptions not only affect the front's supply, but also redefine its striking power. This does not change the pace of the war, but its character. The Kremlin has yet to find a response to these strikes. Pantsir missiles are expensive, S-400 launchers cannot keep up with the number of drones, and train crews are on edge. While state television tries to salvage the day by claiming 74 drones were shot down, social media images of burning locomotives scream the truth. The Rostov front is burning, and the steel network is crumbling into rubble. The issue is no longer how many drones were shot down, but which lines can be restored by tomorrow morning. Drones emerging from Ukraine's digital hive are slicing Russia's iron backbone into pieces. When the logistics wheel stops, the front line will, too. The countdown echoes along the tracks, and instead of trains, sirens wail. Who will continue to turn the switches of Russian railways? The answer grows clearer with each new buzz of a drone. So, how do you think Russia can handle this logistics crisis? How much can these attacks change the course of the war? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinions are valuable to both us and our community. Until we meet again with new developments, take care of yourselves. Thank you for watching. The Russian army has once again come to the brink of collapse. This time it wasn't a platoon that withdrew from the scene, but a fully fledged regiment. There were no orders from above, nor was there an attack on the front lines. The silence in the trenches was actually an echo of how Russian morale had quietly collapsed. Russia's professional army myth has been buried in digital records. So, in a war where desertion from the front lines is so blatant, what victory could the Kremlin still be talking about? Russia's strategic encirclement plan on the northern front has failed. The Kremlin's goal was clear: to tie down Ukraine's defense reserves in the border regions, lock them into the area around Sumy, and ease the pressure on its offensive in the east. For this reason, a large Russian force expanded from around Belgorod and Graveron, and gathered at the border from the north. They crossed the border to undermine the flexible harassment doctrine and push into Ukraine's interior. However, they were met not with an unprepared defense but a planned counterattack. Ukrainian ground forces commander Oleksandr Siersky had anticipated Russia's move months in advance. He established a strong defensive network east of Sumy, particularly along the Kindrativka, Andriivka and Oleksiivka lines. The importance of this line was not only geographical but also strategic. Ukraine would no longer merely defend its border, it would launch a counterattack at the right time and in the right place. Zelensky and Siersky appeared before the cameras and spoke clearly. "We will no longer just defend ourselves." These words represented not just a change in policy, but a direct transformation of the command structure on the ground. The implementation did not delay. Within days, Ukrainian forces launched precision drone strikes against Russian outposts in the region. This was followed by small-scale attrition raids supported by artillery and drones. It was not a heavy attack, but a controlled tactical pressure designed to push the Russian side into impatience. The Russian side initially thought these attacks were a frontal shock. Therefore, instead of sending large reinforcements to the area, they tried to manage with secondary units to protect their positions. However, Ukraine's pressure lasted not hours but days. As a result of intense attacks, first Kindrativka and then Andriivka fell under Ukrainian control. Both villages are located directly on the road to Sumy. This was not just the loss of 2 villages, but a breach in Russia's right flank. Now Ukrainian troops are at the gates of Oleksivka. The village is surrounded on 3 sides. Armored vehicles of the 117th Mechanized Brigade are approaching from the southwest, while infantry units supported by artillery are advancing from the north and east, breaking through the positions. The Russian defense lines are beginning to crumble. The number of retreating soldiers is increasing. That sentence was the first link in a chain that would break apart behind the front lines. Drone operators couldn't keep up with counting the tank turrets. Despite 3 years of harsh conditions, for the first time, an entire brigade was breaking the chain of command and fleeing for their lives. The route of the tank column, which was being broadcast live to global media, was confirmed by satellite companies' subsequent footage. What was visible to the naked eye was this. The convoy turned around Kindrativka, reached the Andriivka border, slipped into the forest line, and instead of turning toward Belgorod, veered north. However, Frontline radio traffic told a different story. Fuel rations had been reduced to 50 litres per soldier. Half of the ammunition had been left behind because the northern depot had blown up during the day shift, and instead of orders, template messages like "hold your positions" were being sent. When there is no hope left, the first rule is broken: the unit saves itself. Thermal images confirmed that they had fled before the engine blocks had cooled. They had no means to wait for a tow truck from their own ranks. The crew abandoned their armor 4 to 5 kilometers from the front line and blended into the riverbank. 1/3 of the attacks targeted ammunition trucks, 1/3 targeted fuel tankers, and the rest targeted portable radar and radio towers. The impact of each successful strike is felt directly at the front. If artillery batteries are firing 600 rounds a day, that number drops below 200 on the evening the depot is hit. Ukrainian analysts call this leakage logistics. Even if the point you hit is small, it cuts off the breadth of infantry and armored vehicles with limited fuel reserves. In the heat of battle, the red light on the engine gauge triggers a collapse in morale. That's when the escape begins. The moral impact of this breakdown spread across social media in just a few hours. Channels created by Russian soldiers' mothers were flooded with posts like, "The Sumi group is silent. My son hasn't written in 5 days." Lists leaked from a mobile storage center in Belgorod confirmed the shortage of fuel wagons. When logistics routes are disrupted by a swarm of drones equivalent to a train, waiting lines can stretch up to 60 hours. At that point, if the commander at the front has no fuel, the only option left is to order the tanks to dig in and wait. The fact that the machines pulled into the line of fire were not designed for trenches also accelerated the escape. The T-80 chassis is heavy. Its tracks sit deep, and it doesn't dig in the rear to prevent movement. Once the fuel runs out, it becomes a massive target. Even the withdrawal orders, issued by commanders, couldn't reach the rear in time because radio towers were frequent targets of Ukrainian FPV attacks. The Ukrainian side did not use this situation merely as a trump card behind the front lines. It also turned it into a media strategy. At the same time, the headline that caught attention in the technical support packages arriving from the West was the land-based variant of the Magura V5 naval drones with extended range. The new kamikaze swarms, designed to strike fuel tankers, not in open terrain, but at river crossings inside the border, were equipped with additional target classification capabilities, thanks to a software update. They could now distinguish between tankers, heavy tanks, and open wagons. On the contrary, Russia remains silent. However, officers on the front lines say that this expansion is militarily unsustainable. Russia once again relied on its armor, but this time it faced not just a defensive line, but a calculated ambush. A massive Russian armored convoy of 71 vehicles was advancing toward Siversk. Inside were tanks, armored personnel carriers, motorcycle reconnaissance units, and fast strike teams. All were deployed to the battlefield, but Russian commanders failed to account for one thing. The 54th and 81st Brigades were waiting exactly where they were supposed to be. What happened next? On July 27th, Russian forces had gathered near the village of Verkhnokhamyanka. 6 T-72B3M tanks, arranged in 3 rows, 3 BMP-2 armored personnel carriers, 6 MT-LB tracked tractors, 1 BEM recovery vehicle, 2 light buggies, and 12 pickup trucks linked together began moving forward. 41 motorcycles were also at the rear of the convoy. The Russian convoy's intention was to launch a surprise attack towards Zolotarivka, first catching the Ukrainian defense off guard, then pushing back the western flank surrounding Siversk. But this time, they were not facing an ordinary defense line. Ukraine's 54th Mechanized Brigade and 81st Airborne Brigade had been preparing in the area for weeks. The convoy's route had been identified beforehand, and a series of drone surveillance points and artillery coordination networks had been set up in the area. The 54th Brigade had been defending this front, which had seen some of the fiercest fighting in the region since 2022. They knew the terrain and the enemy's habits like the back of their hands. The 81st Brigade, meanwhile, was renowned for its rapid response, high mobility, and flanking maneuvers. Two T-64BV tanks from the 81st Air Assault Brigade approached the northern edge of the riverbed and took up positions in the shade. An M113 armored ambulance was parked beside them. As soon as the Russian convoy emerged from the tree line, reconnaissance drones had already taken up positions on the hilltop. As soon as movement was detected, the first salvo arrived with 155mm artillery fire. The Ukrainian tank commander then locked onto a sudden heat signature detected by his thermal imaging system. About 90 meters away, a Russian armored vehicle was slowly emerging from between the trees. Its hull was heavily reinforced with anti-drone grills. This was a T-72B3 with improvised armor enhancements. To protect the approximately 46-ton T-72 and its three-person crew, the grills were welded to the upper structure, along with additional steel panels. The armor protection was reinforced with composite armor and Contact 5 explosive reactive armor systems. While this reinforcement aimed to protect it from airborne FPV attacks, this time death would come not from the sky, but from the barrel of the opposing gun. The Ukrainian sniper quickly made his calculations. The T-64BV's 125mm gun was loaded with a heat round. The Russian tank's blind spot was the dome area at the rear left, where there was no armor reinforcement. After a moment of silence, the trigger was pulled. The shell struck the Russian tank's upper structure, directly beneath the turret. At the moment of the explosion, the turret was thrown aside, and the turret itself jumped half a meter upward. However, the fatal blow was not this. Despite the severe shock, the vehicle managed to maneuver backward by forcing its engine. The damage was critical, but the crew was still inside. The Russian tank could only reach a speed of 50 kilometers per hour on the difficult terrain. The Ukrainian drones, however, were much faster. Within minutes, the drone team lying in ambush on the hilltop released an FPV drone loaded with explosives. The drone flew over the trees and headed toward the Russian tank in the burning forest. It embedded itself in the rear armor and exploded. This second blow ignited the fuel tank. The T-72B3 turned into a ball of flames. Since the ammunition was being transported openly in the automatic loader inside the tank, the fire could not be extinguished. In the panic, some vehicles tried to retreat, but became stuck in the narrow path within the forest. FPV drones were waiting for this opportunity. Kamikaze drones, first targeting the tank turrets and then the engine blocks of the BTRs, shattered the armored line within minutes. However, Ukraine's plan did not end there. The convoy had been stopped. Now it was time for destruction. The 81st Brigade's light infantry units launched an attack along the armored line at a three-quarter angle. At this point in the battle, the Russian side's plan should have been to gain momentum. They couldn't do that either. The reason was the breakdown of logistics. The Brem recovery vehicle accompanying the convoy was preparing to tow the first damaged tank when two more FPVs closed in on it. The driver's door was shattered, and the crane operator was injured. With no team left to rescue the tank, the convoy's speed dropped once again. Thus, the Russian soldiers, surrounded from the sides and rear, were left defenseless in open terrain. They were not given the opportunity to reposition themselves through quick maneuvers and coordinated fire. Russian infantry disembarking from transport vehicles encountered mini-mortar fire, automatic rifles, and homemade explosives before they could even dig in. Some armored vehicles were abandoned in the forest because their equipment had malfunctioned or the crew had been lost. Just a few minutes after the fighting began, at least 5 Russian tanks lined up side by side in an open area at the edge of the forest caught fire simultaneously. All that remained were thick black smoke, the echoes of exploding ammunition, and intertwined piles of metal. Tank turrets were hurled meters away. Some vehicles' ammunition depots exploded from within. Within the first 45 minutes, at least 20 armoured vehicles were rendered inoperable by coordinated fire from Ukrainian artillery and FPV drone teams. Tanks, BMP-2s, armoured personnel carriers and most motorised units were either destroyed by fire or abandoned. Russian units attempting to advance along the narrow forest strip, now under a no-fly zone, were repeatedly detected and subjected to sudden fire. Satellite imagery clearly revealed extensive burn marks, ammunition fragments, and traces of secondary explosions at various points in the area. Tree trunks remained charred and broken, while the ground was littered with craters caused by large-caliber artillery shells. The number of Russian military vehicles left behind after the battle was staggering. Only one BREM armoured recovery vehicle, one MTLB personnel carrier, and one truck remained operational. They were later withdrawn from the area while being monitored by Ukrainian surveillance drones. According to initial estimates, 48 Russian soldiers were neutralized at the scene, while 69 others were injured to varying degrees. Most of the wounded were either pulled from the rubble or found defenseless near the exploding vehicles. Even the basic numbers of this clash demonstrated how the war economy had been turned upside down. Russia had deployed heavy armor worth approximately $90 million. Ukraine, on the other hand, inflicted over 10 times the damage by using 6 Sabot rounds, 12 HET shells, 16 FPV drones, and 8 Excalibur missiles. Beyond the financial toll, the moral damage was immeasurable. According to Ukrainian General Staff data, Russia had hoped to flatten the tank loss curve in the first 25 days of July, but units trapped in sectors like Sumy and Siversk reignited the upward trend. Moscow's only hope was to accelerate the tank repair and overhaul line through Belarus. However, the F-35 task force deployed between Poland and Lithuania was turning every covered wagon on the Brest-Homel railway into a live intelligence source. Reserve tanks were being hit by drone strikes before they could cross the border. Russian commanders were increasingly vocal in their conclusion that a mass offensive strategy was unsustainable at a stage where heavy armor could not reach the front lines safely. Data on Russian fire intensity around Siversk over the past 2 weeks also confirmed this. The daily average of 800 rounds fired per day had dropped to 500. The ammunition conservation order was presented to field artillery units as a paper plan aiming for the same effective fire with 1/3 of the ammunition. In reality, however, less ammunition meant less frequent barrages, giving Ukrainian infantry more room for bold maneuvers. 2 days after the clash, the 81st Brigade dug 3 kilometers further back behind the defense line to expand tank barriers. They were certain that no Russian artillery remained capable of drowning out the sound of construction machinery. Moscow's initial response to this failed offensive was official silence. There is another point not mentioned in the summary data, but frequently discussed behind the scenes at the front. Russia's own drone defense doctrine is proving inadequate in such conflicts. Since no Orlan-10 or Zala reconnaissance UAVs were deployed over the convoy, the approaching FPVs were able to dive freely onto the vehicle tracks. The reason is an electronic warfare vulnerability. The Stavropol signal attack had hit Russian jammer equipment production. It was said that it would take days to see the results on the ground, but the Siversk raid reduced that to hours. The lack of damaged radar jammers at the Kret facilities left the convoy virtually exposed. By the middle of 2025, the real picture on the battlefield had become increasingly alarming for Russia. While some tactical gains were made, the cost of these gains had reached unsustainable levels in terms of both human lives and military equipment. According to data compiled by Western intelligence services and independent analysis organizations, Russia's total losses exceeded 1 million. Approximately 500,000 of these were soldiers who either died in combat or were wounded so severely that they could not return. This is not merely a statistic, it is concrete evidence of the human cost of the war and the depletion of Russia's military personnel reserves. Material losses further compound this grim picture. Since February 2022, approximately 10,000 tanks and over 13,000 artillery systems have been destroyed on the battlefield. The majority of these were neutralized by Ukraine's increasingly precise drone strikes, Western-made long-range munitions, and advanced counter-battery tactics. In particular, since 2024, precision munitions such as Hayhem ARS, AASM Hammer, Excalibur, and Storm Shadow have rendered Russian armored units virtually defenseless on the front lines. However, what is even more striking is that these losses cannot be offset by the production capacity of the Russian military-industrial complex. Relying on Soviet-era production infrastructure from the 1980s, the Russian defense industry is struggling to mass-produce high-tech and high-quality systems. Western sanctions have largely blocked access to sensitive components, such as chips and optical systems. Major tank manufacturers like Uralvagonzavod can only refurbish and send a few dozen tanks to the front each month. New production has nearly ground to a halt. This production bottleneck has made Russia increasingly dependent on foreign suppliers. Since late 2023, North Korea has become Russia's primary source of artillery ammunition. By the end of 2024, it is estimated that up to 60% of the artillery shells in use on the battlefield will have come from North Korea. However, most of these shells have serious quality issues. Some batches have a dud rate of up to 20%, while some munitions have caused barrel swelling and recoil malfunctions. This situation directly affects not only the effectiveness of the munitions, but also the lifespan of the artillery systems used. This enormous cost is fueling silent but significant public discontent. While open protest is dangerous, the sentiment is clear. A survey conducted by the independent Levada Center in late 2024 found that 57% of Russians support peace negotiations, but only 35% want the war to continue. Putin has avoided a second mass mobilization precisely because he fears public backlash. The inability to muster sufficient volunteer forces to cover monthly casualty rates poses a critical obstacle to war efforts. The most visible opposition comes from the wives and mothers of mobilized soldiers, who regularly stage small protests near the Kremlin, demanding the return of their loved ones. The majority of the Russian people may be in a state of passive acquiescence, but this is a fragile consensus born of weakness, not enthusiastic support. The significant increase in the demands of the war on ordinary families could easily shatter this consensus. Given the state's repressive capacity and the fragmented nature of the opposition, a mass popular uprising is the least likely outcome in the near term. However, a devastating military defeat or a complete economic collapse could serve as a black swan event, triggering widespread unrest that could overwhelm the security forces. Let's summarize the situation. The tank duel around Siversk demonstrated how vulnerable classic armored assaults can be in the face of electronic surveillance, drone sabotage, and low-profile ambushes. After 6 minutes of initial fire contact, the fate of the battle was decided not by tracks and firepower, but by the optical algorithm satellite triad. Russia still relies on the shock effect of mass armor, rooted in Soviet psychology. Ukraine, however, has already neutralized this shock by making fire decisions with a single click on a drone screen. While the psychological impact of their losses is downplayed in Moscow corridors as a temporary setback, for the soldier on the front lines, this outcome is the most concrete evidence that the command-fuel ammunition chain can break simultaneously. If Belgorod fuel convoys are not replenished and no new jammers emerge from Stavropol in the coming days, every new tank motorcycle assault order will disintegrate faster than the last. The drone debris and burned tank turrets floating in the Siversk Valley are, for now, a silent but powerful reminder of this. What are your thoughts on this matter? We would appreciate it if you could share your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. Your support is invaluable to us. We look forward to seeing you in our next analysis. Thank you for watching. Russia's Black Sea cities are in flames. Ukraine bombed Putin's valuable assets in Krasnodar and Sochi for the first time. Airports, refineries, and ammunition depots. But that wasn't the most striking part of the operation. Putin had once again launched a major attack on civilian targets in Odessa after the peace talks, but Ukraine immediately retaliated and took its revenge. So what did Putin lose with Ukraine's retaliation, and why did Ukraine strike this blow in Sochi? On July 24th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, at a meeting in Istanbul yesterday, a proposal for an immediate and complete ceasefire was presented to the Russian side. In response, Russian drones are hitting residential buildings. For Kiev, this was a familiar pattern. The talks end, Odessa burns. Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba said that Russia launched 103 drones and 4 missiles in a nighttime attack, striking civilian infrastructure, including ports, transportation hubs, and residential areas. Ukraine then launched a larger retaliatory attack. On the night of July 24th, unmanned aerial vehicles attacked the cities of Sochi and Adler in Russia's Krasnodar region, and an oil depot near Sochi airport was hit. This was not just a simple drone attack, but a blow that destroyed Putin's tourism and oil economy in the Black Sea. The retaliation plan, coded as a counter-cost operation in the sensitive economic semicircle in the report of the Ukrainian General Staff, consisted of 23 unmanned aerial vehicles targeting the Sochi-Adler aviation fuel complex on the eastern slope of the Black Sea. The plan looked simple on the map: take off from the Azov grey zone along the Azov coast, divert westward at sea level under the radar umbrella of the Crimean Peninsula, and climb towards Sochi's blind southeast radar sector over the Taman Peninsula. The actual operational technique went far beyond this. The 91N6E radar, stationed on the 40V6 mast, which Russian air defense had considered an angular lifeguard until now, kept its antenna in a fixed position facing northwest instead of the Black Sea, and therefore could not see the lower 50-meter layer used by the Boba-derived UAD-26s as they drew from the coast. Meanwhile, the thermal optics of the Pantsir S-1 batteries mistook the fake heat masks added in September 2024 for real targets. The electronic warfare compartment was unable to prevent the Boba swarm from switching from dual satellite navigation to topographic matching. Ukraine's raid on Sochi was recorded at 23:07, according to official data from the Civil Aviation Agency, with an alarm sounding in the airport's approach area. Runway lights were dimmed, and 8 aircraft, 3 domestic and 5 charter, were forced to circle in the air. At 23:26, a warning was issued of an uncontrolled fire in the immediate vicinity. This was when the first of the Boba-type UAVs hit a row of fuel tankers north of the runway. Emergency officials in Russia's Black Sea region of Krasnodar confirmed drone attacks at the airport in the Adler district near Sochi. Flights were cancelled for hours. Sochi International Airport was closed between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. 97 flights were delayed in many cities across Russia. Passengers in Novosibirsk, Omsk and Tomsk were stranded, waiting for planes that could not land. The second wave of drones locked onto a refinery storage facility at 11:40 p.m. The most critical facility here was 2 large tanks storing RT-class jet fuel. If they caught fire, Sochi airport would lose its continuous fuel buffer, and even after the runway was opened, it would not be possible to refuel the tankers. The Ukrainian General Staff spokesman confirmed this detail the next morning, saying, "The goal was not to target tourists, but to cut off the fuel supply." The head of the Sirius Federal District south of Sochi said a drone had hit an oil base, but did not provide further details. The Russian Aviation Authority reported that operations at Sochi airport were suspended for about 4 hours. Dmitry Plishkin, head of the Sirius Federal District in Krasnodar Krai, said, "An attack was carried out on an oil depot on Tavricheskaya Street. Lukoil Yugnefta Produkt confirmed that its oil depot at 1/4 Tavricheskaya Street in Sochi had been hit. The storage farm at the port of Sochi is a strategic intermediate station that stores crude oil from the Kachinsky-Tuapse pipeline prior to loading onto sea tankers. This facility also supplies bunker fuel to passenger ships docking at the Sochi port and serves as an emergency fuel oil reserve for 4 thermal power plants in the region. The 2 large storage tanks that exploded had a total capacity of 36,000 cubic meters of jet fuel. The local emergency ministry sprayed firefighting foam around the tanks for 24 hours, but the heat of the fire, which exceeded 250 degrees Celsius, shrunk the metal of the tanks like lemon peel. According to an internal Rosneft report, it will take 10 days to safely remove the remaining fuel. And since the secondary tanks are also full, the Sochi-Tuapse tanker program has been suspended. According to leaked notes from Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the main platform in the convoy was a new version of the UJ-26 Boba. An artificial intelligence module added to the previous variant automatically identifies radar antennas surrounding the target airport and recalculates the flight altitude that will provide the lowest radar cross-section twice per second. Link 16 was closed, meaning that instantaneous route updates were made without the need for allied data streams. When the thermal optics of the Russian Pantsir S-1 batteries failed to detect hot targets flying parallel to the sea, they were slow to lock onto the radar. The S-400's main search radar is mounted on a 40V6 mast facing the coast, with a blind spot in the southeast sector. The Boba swarm climbed out of this blind sector. Technical summary. The fan scan angle on the defense line was not 100%, and Boba exploited this. This was the first time that open-source hardware and software support obtained by Kiev from Baykar, Edge Autonomics, and the Lithuanian-Estonian joint venture Skynetics was tested in the field in a scaled swarm configuration. The most frightening detail for Russia is the reduction of its dependence on global navigation. Boba still uses GPS, but even if the line is cut, it switches to an alternative using topographic matching. For years, Russia has been telling itself the fairy tale of being a shield against the sky. The S-300 and S-400 missile batteries were the pride and joy of Kremlin propaganda. It was claimed they could even shoot down hypersonic missiles. That myth was shattered on the night of July 20th, 2025, on a rural stretch between Belgorod and Kursk. The Ukrainian General Staff summed it up in a few lines. The 91 N6E and 92 N6E radar stations stationed near the villages of Kolodny and Tepel have been destroyed. In other words, the brain of the Russian air defense pyramid was torn from its body. This does not look like a random bombardment. Rather, it looks like a categorical attack against high-value air defense resources, eliminating the direct retroactive effect of tactical targeting and instead directly shattering Russian air superiority in the region. Now let's analyze how this double blow was delivered, why Moscow couldn't respond, and which dominoes each lost radar toppled, from the front lines to the economy. Between February 2022 and July 2025, according to OSINT sources, the following elements were permanently taken out of service in the field. 18 S-400 radar/launch vehicles, 43 S-300 battery components. The cost is approximately $7.8 billion at current list prices. Almazante's annual production is a maximum of 9 complete sets, meaning that the 2 radars in July wiped out the factory's output for 6 months. Let's clarify the picture first. The 91N6E hit at the Kolodny coordinates acts like a National Geographic camera for an S-400 regiment. It scans everything within a 600-kilometer radius and writes targets into subcells. The multifunctional 92N6E radar, parked next to it, acts as a fire control system, guiding the missile from the moment it is fired until the last second. The Baz 69092-012 Voshchina 1 tow trucks pulling this duo also caught fire in the frame. The system lost not only its missiles but also its eyes and ears. The 92N6E is an extremely important radar system used by Russia to monitor vast areas of airspace and quickly detect threats. The S-400's 91N6E long-range reconnaissance radar performs wide-beam scanning and uses narrow filtering to improve the signal-to-noise ratio at low altitudes. If you have a target with an RCS, radar cross-section, of less than 0.05 square meters, the screen will be flooded with interference in milliseconds. HIMARS missiles, on the other hand, have a radar cross-section of less than 0.03 square meters. This is below the threshold value of the radar's automatic target detection algorithm. The operator can only select pixel spots by manually zooming in, at which point the alarm warnings will activate larger traces. Why is a small RCS so critical? While the radar's automatic filter threshold is 0.05 square meters, the GMLRS-ER rocket appears as 0.03 square meters. The warning time before the operator manually zooms in is less than 8 seconds. Considering the hydraulic antenna rotation speed and missile launch timing, this practically means insufficient reaction time. The Ukrainian army silenced a fully operational S-300 and S-400 battery along the Belgorod and Kursk lines in a single night using HIMARS missiles fired from border villages in the Kharkiv region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed in an official statement that Ukraine's long-range air defense capabilities had successfully destroyed Russian S-300P systems and S-400 radar equipment. So how did Russia fail to see such an attack coming? The answer lies in the layered deception package that Ukraine has developed over the past 5 months. In the first layer, kamikaze FPV drones appeared in swarms 10 found 15 kilometers from the front line. They made noise, left electromagnetic traces, and essentially shouted, "I'm coming," to the radar. Russian air defense systems panicked, and Pantsir guns fired at low altitudes. In the second layer, Old Soviet-made Tu-141 Strij reconnaissance drones flew at low altitude with cheap pyrotechnic capsules attached to their wings. They left a fairly large radar signature, but they were unarmored. The S-400 batteries had to waste their expensive 48 N6DM missiles on these shells. This depleted the battery's stock of ammunition and cooled the charging cycle, blocking the firing sequence. By the time the third layer came around, the night sky was silent. The Russian operators had already launched their missiles, and their search radars had been blinded by a swarm of bird drones. It was at this moment that the real punch came. Ukraine has been developing its out-of-range strike capability for a long time. There are many possibilities being discussed, but the strongest scenario coming out of Kiev is that Storm Shadow, Scalp EG, or modernized R-360 Neptune-derived cruise missiles were used. Additionally, analysts suggest that the operation depends on Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, likely HIMARS or ATACMS systems, supplied by the West, and the weakening of targeting restrictions. A common feature of all these systems is their ability to fly at altitudes of 5 to 10 meters by scanning terrain, thereby reducing the risk of detection by using a radar altimeter INS guidance system instead of GPS. Russian radar systems are already blind to such a profile emerging from behind treetops. Moreover, in the terminal phase, the missile's warhead targets not a large radar mast, but the soft underbelly of a stationary tow truck. The impact point was chosen deliberately. Even if the radar antenna is not destroyed, the system will malfunction when the hydraulic power unit and generator are damaged. Don't think that when the radar is hit, only the battery in that village is silenced. The S-400 deployment doctrine resembles a three-layered braid connected by data links. When one eye is lost, neighboring batteries also face the dilemma of send a missile, but who will see the target? This attack also hit an S-300 PT stationed in another area on the Belgorod border on the same day. On the night of July 20th, one of the HIMARS M142s, which fired 6 tubes at once, used American-made GMLRS-ER missiles in actual combat for the first time. The standard M31A1 rocket has a range of 84 kilometers. The ER version, however, reaches 150 kilometers thanks to high-energy composite fuel and an optimized nose cone. The economic front has also been hit. The signal plant's annual revenue target was $720 million, with a quarter of that coming from coastal security radar components intended for export. But the burning of critical equipment will disrupt export deadlines and put pressure on Kret's credit lines. According to VTB Bank's internal assessment, at least $140 million in foreign currency is needed to import new equipment. This is no small additional expense for Moscow's war budget. Before the Stavropol attack, the ruble-dollar exchange rate was at 112. Within the 3-hour window, when the news leaked to the Moscow Stock Exchange, the ruble experienced its fastest daily decline and approached 117. There were no foreign investors left. The real panic was felt by secondary industries whose managers had to pay foreign currency advances for machines with foreign components. In other words, Signal was not just a military facility. It was a factory that injected foreign currency into the regional economy. The fire was put out, and the foreign currency tap dried up. The local government in the Stavropol region noted in its annual report that the factory directly employed 3,000 people and created 11,000 indirect jobs. When production stops, these people will not lose their wages, but they will be forced to accept a drop in their minimum wage. The wheels of the local retail chain slow down. Banks are forced to add exceptions for deferring short-term loan payments. Looking at the supply chain, another area where Russia is under pressure is high-frequency ferrite cores. These cores can be printed in another city via a subcontractor in Belarus, but production time is 3 months at best. In the meantime, there are no new jammers or anti-drone systems to send to the front. This gap seems to be an invitation for Ukraine to accelerate its deep strike strategy. This is because Kiev planners know that 2 of the 6 critical raw material facilities they have identified are linked to the signal factory. They calculate that if a second wave of raids is launched within a few weeks using medium-range unmanned vehicles, repair speeds will not be able to compensate for production losses. Let's turn back the calendar for a moment and put the Volgograd file on the table. On the same night, 2 hours after Stavropol, a reconnaissance suicide drone crashed into a railway bridge near Volgograd, halting the flow of logistics. That bridge is the main route for heavy equipment from the southern military district to the Rostov line. The Ministry of Transport claimed that it would repair the line within 24 hours, but the first satellite images showed that the sleepers under the rails had collapsed in places. This is the second major blow for the Russian front. With the number of artillery shells in the heart of the front already skyrocketing like textile goods on the stock market in Dhaka, even a 48-hour disruption in vehicle and troop movements could be enough to collapse the defense on the Svatov line. There is only one answer to the question of why Ukraine timed the attack to coincide with the final day of the July storm exercise, to create a distraction. During the exercise, Russian air defense networks are focused on the Black Sea and Baltic directions, and command centers are occupied with virtual threats as per the scenario. As a result, internal frontline workshops like Stavropol dropped to low priority status on radar screens. The UJ-26 platform, with its desert yellow fiberglass hull, can evade operators' eyes because it emits such a small signature that it causes point clutter even in the S-400's L-band scan during night flights. This is why the high PRF low RCS alarm code of the radar signal processors did not sound, and when it did, it was confused with exercise traffic. Moscow plans to fix this mistake with new software patches, but the real solution is a thermal optical multi-sensor array and fighter-helicopter pairing, which have remained on paper due to budget and personnel constraints. From a strategic perspective, a critical question remains: can Moscow relocate signal to another region? Theoretically, yes. It could be relocated to the Kazan or Nizhny Novgorod regions. However, the answer to this question becomes increasingly complex, because access to high-precision Japanese servo motors is restricted due to sanctions. Additionally, there is no supply chain to procure the 3-axis laser cutting machines that Japan has halted. The micron tolerance of replacement machines from China cannot meet the standards required for Signal's radar PCBs. Therefore, even if production were to resume, it is estimated that it would not perform as well as before. In the geopolitical context, Western capitals have also begun to view this attack as a window of opportunity. A briefing leaked from the UK Ministry of Defence stated that Russian S-400 radar emissions observed over the Black Sea had fallen by 33% in the last 4 days. Electronic silence means defence for Russia and a reconnaissance paradise for NATO. RQ-4 Global Hawk patrol flights have begun to penetrate deeper into the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Cambia Terzi base in Romania has reintroduced the Wild Weasel mission profile, supported by F-16s, into its training schedule. This is a southern reflection of the domino theory remembered from the Kaliningrad could fall within hours debate at the beginning of July. The Black Sea basin is narrowing, and while Russian electronic eyes are shining, they now have to make do with a limited field of vision. Let's say that despite all this, the Kremlin broke its silence and decided to retaliate. The most reasonable countermeasure would be to send a new drone storm to Kiev or rain Kalibr missiles on the Carpathian bridges. But here too, the cycle bites its own tail. The maintenance kits for the Gearef radars in Krasnodar were also sourced from Signal's burned-out stock. Until new kits arrive, range detection accuracy will decline, meaning incoming missiles will be more vulnerable en route. We have already seen that Sky Sentinel towers are backing up Patriot batteries in Ukraine's lower air defense layer. Cheap AI towers stand guard day and night around Belaya Surkov, giving flexibility to shift missiles earmarked for Kalibr from Patriot to Iris-T. So Russia strikes, Ukraine hits back with cheaper countermeasures, and the balance does not shift in Moscow's favor. The answer to the question of why Ukraine's deep strike doctrine is changing the nature of the war is as follows. The tension that began in 2014, with tank and artillery fire along the Donbass front line, turned into a frontline collapse with the 2022 general invasion. And since the end of 2024, the ammunition stockpiles and electronic warfare capabilities of both sides have been determining the outcome. Cutting off signals is as critical as depleting ammunition. When factories like Signal are destroyed, it's not the number of soldiers that decreases, but the jammer frequency table. This reduction directly increases the likelihood of artillery rockets hitting their targets. That's why the Stavropol attack was not a small-scale strike, but a strategic blow that created the perception of an army that has lost its signal. Ultimately, it appears that Ukraine's drone fleet is no longer targeting frontline objectives, but rather the systemic nerve centers behind the front lines. This strategy achieves the same psychological and logistical impact without depleting high-cost cruise missile stocks. The shutdown of the signal factory in Stavropol will disrupt Russia's jammer production for months, leaving soldiers on the front lines deaf and blind. The regional economy will falter, and the Kremlin will feel a gap in its defense line against the outside world. This butterfly effect once again highlights how a small roof section can impact a front stretching thousands of kilometers. It seems that an era of electronic silence has begun, and this silence does not bode well for either Russia's production lines or frontline command centers. What are your thoughts on this matter? Your ideas inspire us. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. NATO is no longer content with drawing borders. It is building a steel wall on top of them. As fifth-generation F-35 jets land in Poland, the sound of their engines echoes in the Kremlin's nerves. Moscow is already losing blood in the war in Ukraine. Now it faces NATO's digital war fortress being built to the east. This is not just a deployment, it is a direct challenge. How long can the Kremlin withstand this power, which is now felt not just at the border, but right on its doorstep? It's not just F-16s landing at Lask and Kryzhyny air bases anymore. The new sound, approaching the runways, belongs to F-35s. These advanced fighter jets are being deployed to Poland as part of NATO. The F-35s, born in Lockheed Martin hangars, arrived with Dutch and Norwegian cockpit logos. But their destination is NATO's Eastern Shield. The temporary deployment order, signed in The Hague at the beginning of July, was initially perceived by diplomatic circles as a routine exercise maneuver. However, every defense analyst who delved into the details noticed the structural transformation underlying the temporary designation. The official calendar says that 12 F-35As of the Royal Netherlands Air Force will be sent to the 32nd base in Lask from September 1st to December 1st, and 6 aircraft belonging to the Royal Norwegian Air Force will be sent to Kryzhyny for Baltic air policing duties. The details are even more intriguing. Once the rotation is complete, these aircraft will be replaced by Danish and then Italian platforms. This means that at least one fleet of fifth-generation jets will be maintained in a ready alert status in Polish airspace every day of the year. The F-35 is not just a fighter jet, it is a system that can transform into a command and control center in a digital warfare environment, evade radar systems with its low visibility, and maximize its chances of survival in multi-threat environments. When compared to previous generation platforms like the F-16 or Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-35's greatest advantage is its ability to establish an invisible digital network among allied countries through real-time data sharing enabled by sensor fusion. The F-35's mission spectrum covers a wide range of areas, including air superiority, electronic warfare, precision-guided strikes, reconnaissance, and intelligence. Whatever threat is on the battlefield, the F-35 has an answer. The Polish Ministry of Defense began preparing this infrastructure nearly a decade ago. Closed hangars that once housed Soviet MiG-29s have been converted into climate-controlled cells suitable for the F-35's low-visibility coating. Faraday cages have been installed to prevent data leakage in the electromagnetic environment, and runway lighting has been updated to meet the requirements of the sensitive infrared landing profile. But the real investment is in radar. Poland already had 2 Patriot PAK-3 MSE batteries and a domestically produced Pilixa short-range gun missile hybrid. When the Giraffe 4A search radar, purchased from Sweden by the end of 2024, was deployed to close the Patriot's sector blind spot, a full 360-degree Link 16 environment was established for the first time at the NATO Integration Center. When the F-35's sensor fusion was integrated into this network, the land, air, and cyber layers converged on a single screen. A pilot in a Norwegian cockpit tracks a Belarusian unmanned aerial vehicle flying over the Suwalki corridor in real time and sends a tag to the Warsaw Command Center. The same signal is reflected at the Danish air defense node. From there, it reaches the Aegis processor of an Iver Huitfeldt destroyer patrolling the Baltic Sea, and the chain can be closed with a missile strike. This scenario was unimaginable a decade ago. Now, Polish security radio routinely announces Sigma Link stable, fusion green. What is keeping Moscow awake is not the sound of F-35 engines, but this integrated data network. Because the Russian 152nd Artillery Brigade stationed in the Kaliningrad exclave, which is covered by an access-blocking umbrella of IS-300V4 and S-400 batteries, still uses a command and control network from the 1980s at its center. The system, which has been converted from analog to digital, receives command packets from the Leningrad military district and distributes them to Bastion launch vehicles. But there is a millisecond delay when the data is repackaged. At that moment, the F-35 can switch itself into stealth mode before it becomes a missile and silence the signal on the radar screen. On the Russian operator's screen, a wavy line appears, resembling a one-time interference that might suggest a faulty connection. In reality, that signal is an electronic attack tactic, employed by a lightning jet taking off from Wask. In other words, a NATO jet taking off from a Polish runway can infiltrate Kaliningrad's launch kill chain and delay the S-400 launcher's firing authorization. This is why the Baltic sky is foggy for Moscow. Who emerged from the fog? At what altitude are they flying? What are their intentions? Are they alone or in a group? To understand the true scale of the Poland F-35 wall, we need to examine the details a bit more closely. For example, radar SAM integration. Warsaw has divided its surface-to-air defense layer into 3 tiers: Patriot PAC-3 long-range, Kam-ER medium-range, and Pilica gun missile hybrid close-range. At the top, the F-35's APG-81 AESA radar detects the plasma trail emitted from the nose of an Iskander-M ballistic missile 100 kilometers away and transmits it to the Patriot battery below. The Kam-ER battery in the middle can share targets via Link 16 signals, even if they don't touch each other. At the bottom, Pilica draws a microdome with a radius of 10 kilometers. If the Lancet drone enters that dome, automatic cannon fire is activated. This neutralizes Russia's recently tested hit with a ballistic missile and finish with cheap ammunition tactic. Ballistic missiles are caught by Patriot, drones fall in the dome, and the cost of missile defense is not noticeable because the payload is shot down in the air before it can be caught. This arrangement is the Polish version of the philosophy of expensive in quality, cheap in quantity. Poland's F-35 wall is not just an air defense concept, but already a response to Russia's border test flights and air policing missions. In May, following a wave of missile and drone attacks launched by Russia against Ukraine, the Polish armed forces issued an emergency military air alert and scrambled fighter jets. In April, when a Tu-214R signal intelligence aircraft left Kaliningrad airspace over the Baltic Sea and followed a zigzag course toward Gotland Island, 2 F-16s took off from Kresiny and formed the first interception band. Shortly thereafter, however, the Polish Operations Center decided to include the Cyber-EW capabilities of the F-35s in such measures. Now, interception means more than just escorting. The pilot in the Lightning cockpit can jam the Russian intelligence aircraft's data transmission frequency using a national jammer set, overload the band, disrupt the image, and send empty packets back to the Russian aircraft. This operation draws its energy from the electronic attack portfolio allocated by all NATO members. All of this is an unpleasant equation for the Kremlin. Russia's "We are here" message is turning into a vulnerability in the signal environment and a risk of data loss. The financial cost of this deterrence layer is a new debate for European voters. A single F-35A costs approximately $83 million for the Polish budget. Poland had already ordered 32 from the US. With the temporary additions from the Netherlands and Norway, the number of aircraft on the runway stands at 2 squadrons, or 24 planes. The annual flight and maintenance cost for a Lightning is estimated at $7.1 million. Thanks to NATO's cost-sharing arrangement, it is claimed that the same aircraft will not burden Poland's treasury alone throughout its operational lifespan. However, the opposition is using the term 3 vampires. That is, the Patriot Pass-3, Abrams M1A2 SPV-3 tanks, and the F-35. The Ministry of Defense responds, "If these aircraft do not arrive, there will be blind spots on the Patriot radar, and our tanks will not be able to advance without coordinates from the aircraft." In short, the bricks of the wall are expensive, but if they are moved, the house behind them will collapse. Moscow's official response is predictably harsh. Threats are flying that, if air activity around Kaliningrad reaches provocative levels, we will take military technical measures. What diplomats call military technical measures usually means moving the Iskander division to Belarus or displaying Kalibr missiles from the Baltic fleet. But the Belarus factor is now more complicated than before. The vanguard of the German 10th Mechanized Division has already begun rotating Leopard tanks at the Rukla base near Vilnius. This is the second curtain closing off the Suwałki corridor from the east. While Poland's F-35 wall watches the north, German-Lithuanian landlines block the southern axis. The possibility of opening a land bridge through Belarus is becoming the riskiest move on the table. Moreover, Russia's First Guards tank army has not yet returned to full capacity following heavy losses in February 2022, and personnel shortages are being addressed through voluntary contracts. There is also a motivation issue here. If the Kremlin empties its reserves in Kaliningrad to Belarus, the combat group defending the exclave will be weakened. If it does not fill them, it will not be able to show sufficient force against pressure from the Suwałki corridor. The most critical capability of the F-35 wall against Russia is that it forces Kaliningrad to face the feeling of having its A2AD dome riddled with holes. The S-400 complex in Kaliningrad can launch a 40 N6 radar-guided missile 400 kilometers away in a single shot, but the radar seeker lock is broken by the target's evasive maneuvers. When the F-35's low visibility and electronic jamming package work simultaneously, the radar lock may not be stable, and most of the missiles will lose their target in the terminal phase and destroy themselves. This puts the Russian defense commander in a dilemma between spending his expensive stockpile and remaining passive. If they remain passive, NATO's early warning reconnaissance flights will enter through the front door. If they remain active, the risk of all-out war will escalate. The Kremlin had believed it had resolved this dilemma by playing the tactical nuclear stockpile card, but the F-35 wall is showing that this card may also be a bluff. This is because Poland's tower-type autonomous air defense system is about to achieve the flexibility to detect low-altitude Iskander missile launchers and strike them with a swarm of drones. In other words, the moment the "I'll transfer nuclear warheads and make tactical strikes" argument is put on the table, the point of departure becomes a risk. The next step in Poland's defense doctrine is to transfer the integrated command cloud to the army. The Americans call this the sensor-to-shooter loop. In the electromagnetic spectrum, the target detected by the F-35 is transferred to the Patriot, then to the HIMARS battery, and finally to Turkish kamikaze drones deployed on the ground. At every step, decision-making time is shortened, and within seconds, another strike force can be deployed before enemy ground units receive ammunition. This is why concrete armor panels have been added to radar towers in Russia's Kaliningrad Special Administrative Region in recent months. Underground data lines are being upgraded, and mobile radar trucks are being moved into shelters with sliding roofs. In other words, Moscow is rushing to remove its most valuable sensor clusters from being fixed targets. But no matter how mobile they are, the F-35's passive sensors mark the line as soon as they detect a radar truck broadcasting radio signals and send the information to Allied destroyers at sea. That destroyer then launches an SM-2 missile. The mobile target has only 3 to 5 seconds to escape the fixed missile. There is also a social dimension to this power game. The Polish public has long viewed the Russian threat not as an abstract danger, but as a direct part of life. Even during the winter, when natural gas prices skyrocketed, complaints about energy bills in street interviews were linked to the statement, "There is NATO support against Russian aggression." The arrival of the F-35s is perceived as psychological credit that eases the burden of economic austerity. Yes, they are expensive, but they protect us. Every time the Air Force takes off or lands, it is shared on social media, creating a digital watchdog image in the minds of the young population. NATO is not shy about turning this sympathy into money. Warsaw is receiving a larger-than-expected share of European Defence Fund grants. The only condition is that Polish industry must have at least a 40% share in tenders for Patriot maintenance and repair, F-35 runway renovation, and integrated radar modernization. The Kremlin media is producing its own counter-propaganda. The F-35 does not carry Poland's security, but NATO's nuclear bombs. But the era of information black boxes is over. Polish viewers can read the Kremlin and Pentagon statements simultaneously on their cell phones with English subtitles. This popularity is also shaping Polish politics. Even the opposition coalition is isolating the F-35 issue from budget criticism because polls show that 75% say, yes, we need these planes. However, the uncertainty continues. The Baltic security domino scenario could be triggered by a single incident: a border violation, a false radar signal from a fuel tank fire leading to an F-35 scramble, an early launch error of the S-400 in Kaliningrad, a spiral escalation within seconds. That's why NATO isn't keeping its air policing in full idle mode. Every scramble operates like a drill, with pilots developing reflexes akin to those of World Cup goalkeepers. On screens floating throughout the Warsaw Air Operations Center, live data stretching from Rzeszów to Krosno even tags Kaliningrad's piston engine training aircraft. Because the escalation thread is thin, there is no room for error. The real power of the F-35 wall is kept on alert but not fired unless necessary. When fired, it delivers a single decisive blow, forcing the enemy to recalculate. Moscow's nightmare is precisely this: a system that leaks data, loses signals, wastes expensive missiles, and worst of all, cannot provide a clear answer to the question, what is our response if something heavy comes? As can be seen, Poland is not experiencing a quiet rise. On the contrary, it is undergoing a loud and ambitious military transformation process that is attracting the attention of all of Europe and Moscow. By the end of 2025, Poland will have allocated 4.7% of its gross domestic product to defense spending. This is more than double NATO's target of 2%, and currently the highest among all alliance members, including the US. This figure alone clearly shows that Poland aims to be not just a regional player, but a strategic center of gravity on NATO's eastern flank. Poland's military spending is so extensive and sophisticated that even calling it a shopping spree would be an understatement. This is a full-scale transformation project involving the most advanced technologies on the continent. Some of the systems that have been ordered and are currently being delivered include 32 F-35 Lightning II aircraft, 300 over 500 HIMARS and K-239 Chunmoo multiple rocket launchers, K-2 Black Panther tanks, and K-9 Thunder howitzers. Poland is not only upgrading its equipment, but also transforming its human resources capacity. The number of troops, which reached 180,000 by 2024, is set to increase to 300,000 in the near future. The ultimate goal is a permanent army of 500,000. This number is unmatched not only in Europe but also in many NATO countries. At the same time, structural reforms such as the transition to professional soldiery, the establishment of volunteer reserve units, and the extension of military education down to the high school level are also progressing. Poland now not only has the equipment, but is also building the human resources to use these systems effectively at the tactical level. Let's be honest. Russia may be a superpower, but it is no longer remembered for its armor, but for its wounds. The war in Ukraine is not only a military arena for Russia, but also a grinding machine. Every day, hundreds of soldiers go to the front, but many do not return. According to Western intelligence agencies, Russia has lost more than 1 million people so far, including those killed, wounded, and disabled. Armored units? A country that once boasted of its Soviet tank armies has lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. In some areas, they have even been forced to deploy T-62 tanks from the 1960s. Aircraft losses are also significant. Thanks to Ukraine's air defense systems and modern weapons from the West, hundreds of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft have been shot down or destroyed in their hangars. But there is another front that is just as devastating as the military losses: the economy. The war and sanctions are cutting off Russia's economic lifelines one by one. A system dependent on oil and natural gas exports is now struggling to find markets for its products. High-tech imports have come to a standstill. The banking system has been isolated and the ruble has gone into free fall at times. Defense industry production is faltering due to the embargo, as many critical components, from chips to bearings, came from the West. Domestically, the situation is more complex. A significant portion of the young population is either at the front or has left the country. While large segments of society are quietly shouldering the burden of this war, the official rhetoric of the state continues to be one of victory. But in reality, cracks are widening within the Kremlin. morale is flagging within the army, and the system is becoming increasingly fragile. In short, Poland's long history of being seen as nothing more than a buffer zone, a transit corridor, or a geopolitical obstacle caught between two powers is now a thing of the past. Today's Poland is no longer just a country defending its borders, but an independent military power, playing a key role in the European security architecture. This new Poland is not only present on the battlefield with tanks, jets and missiles, but also with its determination, investments in the defense industry, and claims to regional leadership. This is precisely why, for those in the Kremlin who still draw maps in Soviet colors, Warsaw is no longer just a capital city. It is a serious threat that disrupts plans, confuses calculations, and refuses to bow to intimidation. Poland is no longer a wall in Europe's security architecture. It is a cornerstone, and this cornerstone has no intention of moving from its place. Thank you for watching. NATO is no longer content with drawing borders. It is building a steel wall on top of them. As fifth-generation F-35 jets land in Poland, the sound of their engines echoes in the Kremlin's nerves. Moscow is already losing blood in the war in Ukraine. Now it faces NATO's digital war fortress being built to the east. This is not just a deployment, it is a direct challenge. How long can the Kremlin withstand this power, which is now felt not just at the border, but right on its doorstep? It's not just F-16s landing at Lask and Krzyzhny air bases anymore. The new sound, approaching the runways, belongs to F-35s. These advanced fighter jets are being deployed to Poland as part of NATO. The F-35s, born in Lockheed Martin hangars, arrived with Dutch and Norwegian cockpit logos. But their destination is NATO's Eastern Shield. The temporary deployment order, signed in The Hague at the beginning of July, was initially perceived by diplomatic circles as a routine exercise maneuver. However, every defense analyst who delved into the details noticed the structural transformation underlying the temporary designation. The official calendar says that 12 F-35As of the Royal Netherlands Air Force will be sent to the 32nd base in Lask from September 1st to December 1st, and 6 aircraft belonging to the Royal Norwegian Air Force will be sent to Krzyzhny for Baltic air policing duties. The details are even more intriguing. Once the rotation is complete, these aircraft will be replaced by Danish and then Italian platforms. This means that at least one fleet of fifth-generation jets will be maintained in a ready alert status in Polish airspace every day of the year. The F-35 is not just a fighter jet, it is a system that can transform into a command and control center in a digital warfare environment, evade radar systems with its low visibility, and maximize its chances of survival in multi-threat environments. When compared to previous generation platforms like the F-16 or Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-35's greatest advantage is its ability to establish an invisible digital network among allied countries through real-time data sharing enabled by sensor fusion. The F-35's mission spectrum covers a wide range of areas, including air superiority, electronic warfare, precision-guided strikes, reconnaissance, and intelligence. Whatever threat is on the battlefield, the F-35 has an answer. The Polish Ministry of Defense began preparing this infrastructure nearly a decade ago. Closed hangars that once housed Soviet MiG-29s have been converted into climate-controlled cells suitable for the F-35's low-visibility coating. Faraday cages have been installed to prevent data leakage in the electromagnetic environment, and runway lighting has been updated to meet the requirements of the sensitive infrared landing profile. But the real investment is in radar. Poland already had 2 Patriot PAK-3 MSE batteries and a domestically produced Pilixa short-range gun missile hybrid. When the Giraffe 4A search radar, purchased from Sweden by the end of 2024, was deployed to close the Patriot's sector blind spot, a full 360-degree Link 16 environment was established for the first time at the NATO Integration Center. When the F-35's sensor fusion was integrated into this network, the land, air, and cyber layers converged on a single screen. A pilot in a Norwegian cockpit tracks a Belarusian unmanned aerial vehicle flying over the Suwalki corridor in real time and sends a tag to the Warsaw Command Center. The same signal is reflected at the Danish air defense node. From there, it reaches the Aegis processor of an Iver Huitfeldt destroyer patrolling the Baltic Sea, and the chain can be closed with a missile strike. This scenario was unimaginable a decade ago. Now, Polish security radio routinely announces Sigma link stable, fusion green. What is keeping Moscow awake is not the sound of F-35 engines, but this integrated data network. Because the Russian 152nd Artillery Brigade stationed in the Kaliningrad exclave, which is covered by an access-blocking umbrella of IS-300V4 and S-400 batteries, still uses a command and control network from the 1980s at its center. The system, which has been converted from analog to digital, receives command packets from the Leningrad military district and distributes them to Bastion launch vehicles. But there is a millisecond delay when the data is repackaged. At that moment, the F-35 can switch itself into stealth mode before it becomes a missile and silence the signal on the radar screen. On the Russian operator's screen, a wavy line appears, resembling a one-time interference that might suggest a faulty connection. In reality, that signal is an electronic attack tactic, employed by a lightning jet taking off from Wask. In other words, a NATO jet taking off from a Polish runway can infiltrate Kaliningrad's launch kill chain and delay the S-400 launcher's firing authorization. This is why the Baltic sky is foggy for Moscow. Who emerged from the fog? At what altitude are they flying? What are their intentions? Are they alone or in a group? To understand the true scale of the Poland F-35 wall, we need to examine the details a bit more closely. For example, radar SAM integration. Warsaw has divided its surface-to-air defense layer into 3 tiers: Patriot PAC-3 long range, CAM-ER medium range, and Pilica gun missile hybrid close range. At the top, the F-35's APG-81 AESA radar detects the plasma trail emitted from the nose of an Iskander-M ballistic missile 100 kilometers away and transmits it to the Patriot battery below. The CAM-ER battery in the middle can share targets via Link 16 signals, even if they don't touch each other. At the bottom, Pilica draws a microdome with a radius of 10 kilometers. If the Lancet drone enters that dome, automatic cannon fire is activated. This neutralizes Russia's recently tested hit with a ballistic missile and finish with cheap ammunition tactic. Ballistic missiles are caught by Patriot, drones fall in the dome, and the cost of missile defense is not noticeable because the payload is shot down in the air before it can be caught. This arrangement is the Polish version of the philosophy of expensive in quality, cheap in quantity. Poland's F-35 wall is not just an air defense concept, but already a response to Russia's border test flights and air policing missions. In May, following a wave of missile and drone attacks launched by Russia against Ukraine, the Polish armed forces issued an emergency military air alert and scrambled fighter jets. In April, when a Tu-214R signal intelligence aircraft left Kaliningrad airspace over the Baltic Sea and followed a zigzag course toward Gotland Island, 2 F-16s took off from Kresiny and formed the first interception band. Shortly thereafter, however, the Polish Operations Center decided to include the Cyber-EW capabilities of the F-35s in such measures. Now, interception means more than just escorting. The pilot in the Lightning cockpit can jam the Russian intelligence aircraft's data transmission frequency using a national jammer set, overload the band, disrupt the image, and send empty packets back to the Russian aircraft. This operation draws its energy from the electronic attack portfolio allocated by all NATO members. All of this is an unpleasant equation for the Kremlin. Russia's "We are here" message is turning into a vulnerability in the signal environment and a risk of data loss. The financial cost of this deterrence layer is a new debate for European voters. A single F-35A costs approximately $83 million for the Polish budget. Poland had already ordered 32 from the US. With the temporary additions from the Netherlands and Norway, the number of aircraft on the runway stands at 2 squadrons, or 24 planes. The annual flight and maintenance cost for a Lightning is estimated at $7.1 million. Thanks to NATO's cost-sharing arrangement, it is claimed that the same aircraft will not burden Poland's treasury alone throughout its operational lifespan. However, the opposition is using the term 3 vampires. That is, the Patriot Pass-3, Abrams M1A2 SPV-3 tanks, and the F-35. The Ministry of Defense responds, "If these aircraft do not arrive, there will be blind spots on the Patriot radar, and our tanks will not be able to advance without coordinates from the aircraft." In short, the bricks of the wall are expensive, but if they are moved, the house behind them will collapse. Moscow's official response is predictably harsh. Threats are flying that, if air activity around Kaliningrad reaches provocative levels, We will take military technical measures. What diplomats call military technical measures usually means moving the Iskander division to Belarus or displaying Kalibr missiles from the Baltic fleet. But the Belarus factor is now more complicated than before. The vanguard of the German 10th Mechanized Division has already begun rotating Leopard tanks at the Rukla base near Vilnius. This is the second curtain closing off the Suwałki corridor from the east. While Poland's F-35 wall watches the north, German-Lithuanian landlines block the southern axis. The possibility of opening a land bridge through Belarus is becoming the riskiest move on the table. Moreover, Russia's First Guards tank army has not yet returned to full capacity following heavy losses in February 2022, and personnel shortages are being addressed through voluntary contracts. There is also a motivation issue here. If the Kremlin empties its reserves in Kaliningrad to Belarus, the combat group defending the exclave will be weakened. If it does not fill them, it will not be able to show sufficient force against pressure from the Suwałki corridor. The most critical capability of the F-35 wall against Russia is that it forces Kaliningrad to face the feeling of having its A2AD dome riddled with holes. The S-400 complex in Kaliningrad can launch a 40 N6 radar-guided missile 400 kilometers away in a single shot, but the radar seeker lock is broken by the target's evasive maneuvers. When the F-35's low visibility and electronic jamming package work simultaneously, the radar lock may not be stable, and most of the missiles will lose their target in the terminal phase and destroy themselves. This puts the Russian defense commander in a dilemma between spending his expensive stockpile and remaining passive. If they remain passive, NATO's early warning reconnaissance flights will enter through the front door. If they remain active, the risk of all-out war will escalate. The Kremlin had believed it had resolved this dilemma by playing the tactical nuclear stockpile card, but the F-35 wall is showing that this card may also be a bluff. This is because Poland's tower-type autonomous air defense system is about to achieve the flexibility to detect low-altitude Iskander missile launchers and strike them with a swarm of drones. In other words, the moment the "I'll transfer nuclear warheads and make tactical strikes" argument is put on the table, the point of departure becomes a risk. The next step in Poland's defense doctrine is to transfer the integrated command cloud to the army. The Americans call this the sensor-to-shooter loop. In the electromagnetic spectrum, the target detected by the F-35 is transferred to the Patriot, then to the HIMARS battery, and finally to Turkish kamikaze drones deployed on the ground. At every step, decision-making time is shortened, and within seconds, another strike force can be deployed before enemy ground units receive ammunition. This is why concrete armor panels have been added to radar towers in Russia's Kaliningrad Special Administrative Region in recent months. Underground data lines are being upgraded, and mobile radar trucks are being moved into shelters with sliding roofs. In other words, Moscow is rushing to remove its most valuable sensor clusters from being fixed targets. But no matter how mobile they are, the F-35's passive sensors mark the line as soon as they detect a radar truck broadcasting radio signals and send the information to Allied destroyers at sea. That destroyer then launches an SM-2 missile. The mobile target has only 3 to 5 seconds to escape the fixed missile. There is also a social dimension to this power game. The Polish public has long viewed the Russian threat not as an abstract danger, but as a direct part of life. Even during the winter, when natural gas prices skyrocketed, complaints about energy bills in street interviews were linked to the statement, "There is NATO support against Russian aggression." The arrival of the F-35s is perceived as psychological credit that eases the burden of economic austerity. Yes, they are expensive, but they protect us. Every time the Air Force takes off or lands, it is shared on social media, creating a digital watchdog image in the minds of the young population. NATO is not shy about turning this sympathy into money. Warsaw is receiving a larger-than-expected share of European Defence Fund grants. The only condition is that Polish industry must have at least a 40% share in tenders for Patriot maintenance and repair, F-35 runway renovation, and integrated radar modernization. The Kremlin media is producing its own counter-propaganda. The F-35 does not carry Poland's security, but NATO's nuclear bombs. But the era of information black boxes is over. Polish viewers can read the Kremlin and Pentagon statements simultaneously on their cell phones with English subtitles. This popularity is also shaping Polish politics. Even the opposition coalition is isolating the F-35 issue from budget criticism because polls show that 75% say, yes, we need these planes. However, the uncertainty continues. The Baltic security domino scenario could be triggered by a single incident: a border violation, a false radar signal from a fuel tank fire leading to an F-35 scramble, an early launch error of the S-400 in Kaliningrad, a spiral escalation within seconds. That's why NATO isn't keeping its air policing in full idle mode. Every scramble operates like a drill, with pilots developing reflexes akin to those of World Cup goalkeepers. On screens floating throughout the Warsaw Air Operations Center, live data stretching from Rzeszów to Krosno even tags Kaliningrad's piston engine training aircraft. Because the escalation thread is thin, there is no room for error. The real power of the F-35 wall is kept on alert but not fired unless necessary. When fired, it delivers a single decisive blow, forcing the enemy to recalculate. Moscow's nightmare is precisely this: a system that leaks data, loses signals, wastes expensive missiles, and worst of all, cannot provide a clear answer to the question, what is our response if something heavy comes? As can be seen, Poland is not experiencing a quiet rise. On the contrary, it is undergoing a loud and ambitious military transformation process that is attracting the attention of all of Europe and Moscow. By the end of 2025, Poland will have allocated 4.7% of its gross domestic product to defense spending. This is more than double NATO's target of 2%, and currently the highest among all alliance members, including the US. This figure alone clearly shows that Poland aims to be not just a regional player, but a strategic center of gravity on NATO's eastern flank. Poland's military spending is so extensive and sophisticated that even calling it a shopping spree would be an understatement. This is a full-scale transformation project involving the most advanced technologies on the continent. Some of the systems that have been ordered and are currently being delivered include 32 F-35 Lightning II aircraft, 300 over 500 HIMARS and K-239 Chunmoo multiple rocket launchers, K-2 Black Panther tanks, and K-9 Thunder howitzers. Poland is not only upgrading its equipment, but also transforming its human resources capacity. The number of troops, which reached 180,000 by 2024, is set to increase to 300,000 in the near future. The ultimate goal is a permanent army of 500,000. This number is unmatched not only in Europe but also in many NATO countries. At the same time, structural reforms such as the transition to professional soldiery, the establishment of volunteer reserve units, and the extension of military education down to the high school level are also progressing. Poland now not only has the equipment, but is also building the human resources to use these systems effectively at the tactical level. Let's be honest. Russia may be a superpower, but it is no longer remembered for its armor, but for its wounds. The war in Ukraine is not only a military arena for Russia, but also a grinding machine. Every day, hundreds of soldiers go to the front, but many do not return. According to Western intelligence agencies, Russia has lost more than 1 million people so far, including those killed, wounded, and disabled. Armored units? A country that once boasted of its Soviet tank armies has lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. In some areas, they have even been forced to deploy T-62 tanks from the 1960s. Aircraft losses are also significant. Thanks to Ukraine's air defense systems and modern weapons from the West, hundreds of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft have been shot down or destroyed in their hangars. But there is another front that is just as devastating as the military losses: the economy. The war and sanctions are cutting off Russia's economic lifelines one by one. A system dependent on oil and natural gas exports is now struggling to find markets for its products. High-tech imports have come to a standstill. The banking system has been isolated and the ruble has gone into free fall at times. Defense industry production is faltering due to the embargo, as many critical components, from chips to bearings, came from the West. Domestically, the situation is more complex. A significant portion of the young population is either at the front or has left the country. While large segments of society are quietly shouldering the burden of this war, the official rhetoric of the state continues to be one of victory. But in reality, cracks are widening within the Kremlin. Morale is flagging within the army, and the system is becoming increasingly fragile. In short, Poland's long history of being seen as nothing more than a buffer zone, a transit corridor, or a geopolitical obstacle caught between two powers is now a thing of the past. Today's Poland is no longer just a country defending its borders, but an independent military power, playing a key role in the European security architecture. This new Poland is not only present on the battlefield with tanks, jets and missiles, but also with its determination, investments in the defense industry, and claims to regional leadership. This is precisely why, for those in the Kremlin who still draw maps in Soviet colors, Warsaw is no longer just a capital city. It is a serious threat that disrupts plans, confuses calculations, and refuses to bow to intimidation. Poland is no longer a wall in Europe's security architecture. It is a cornerstone, and this cornerstone has no intention of moving from its place. Thank you for watching.